There is a version of this story that begins in fire and ends in shadow, and that version is not the one worth telling tonight. The version worth telling begins much earlier, in the long quiet before the danger had a name, in the years when the world that would eventually be shaken was still going about the unhurried business of being itself. Hobbits tending gardens in the Shire, rangers moving without fanfare through the unmapped places between settlements, and one old wanderer in a grey travelling cloak sitting very still in the gathering dark, turning a question over and over in his mind the way a river turns a stone, patient and persistent and entirely without urgency, because the question had not yet become urgent, or rather because he had not yet allowed himself to admit that it had. This is the story of that turning. It is the story of the search that made the quest possible, the watch that had to be kept before the fellowship could be formed, the long and largely unwitnessed work of those who understood what was at stake before anyone else did, and who carried that understanding alone through years that left no record of their passing. It is not a story of battles, though it moves through dangerous country. It is not a story of glory, though it required extraordinary dedication. It is a story about patience, about the particular kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like very little at all. Settle now into the quiet of this telling. The road is long, and the night is deep, and there is no reason to hurry. Let everything outside this moment become distant and soft. The story will hold you gently, and it will bring you, in its own time and at its own unhurried pace, to rest. There are questions that begin as discomfort, a small wrongness in the texture of a familiar thing, a detail that refuses to resolve itself into the pattern it ought to fit, a thought that arrives at odd hours and lingers longer than it should. Gandalf the Grey had known many such questions in the long centuries of his sojourn in Middle-earth, and he had learned to take them seriously, because the world had a way of encoding its most important warnings in exactly this register, not as thunderclaps or urgent visions, but as the quiet, persistent wrongness of something that almost made sense. The question that would eventually become the hunt for Gollum began this way. It began not in the year that Bilbo Baggins vanished from his own birthday party with a ring on his finger and laughter in the air behind him, and not in the 60 years before that, when Bilbo first acquired the ring in the dark beneath the Misty Mountains, but somewhere in the long, slow accumulation of Gandalf's unease that stretched across both of those events, and found no satisfying resolution in either of them. He had been watching hobbits for a long time, longer than hobbits themselves knew, longer than most peoples of Middle-earth would have credited, because Gandalf had recognised in the hobbit nature something that the larger and more dramatic peoples of the world tended to overlook, a quality of resilience that did not announce itself, a capacity for bearing weight that was entirely invisible until the weight was actually applied. He had watched the Shire with the attention of someone who understood that the unremarkable places of the world are not unremarkable because nothing of consequence happens in them, but because consequence arrives there without the costume that announces its presence in grander settings. He had known Bilbo Baggins for many years before the business with the dragon, had known him as a particular kind of hobbit, one in whom the hereditary took adventurousness had not been entirely extinguished by the hereditary Baggins respectability, and he had arranged, with the full intention of one who does not believe in coincidence, for Bilbo to be present on the morning that a company of 13 dwarves required a burglar on short notice. What came back from that adventure was a hobbit who was, in the ways that could be measured, very much the same hobbit who had set out. Bilbo returned to Bag End with a modest portion of dragon gold, a great many stories he told only to the hobbits patient enough to listen to all of them, and a ring of plain gold that he wore on a chain and referred to, when he referred to it at all, as his lucky ring. Gandalf had noticed the ring. He had noticed, in the way that Gandalf noticed things, that Bilbo's manner when the ring was mentioned was subtly different from his manner at other times, not secretive exactly, not defensive, but careful in a way that sat oddly against Bilbo's usual frankness. He had set the observation beside his other observations and allowed it to rest there, turning slowly, waiting for the pattern that would tell him what it meant. The turning took decades. Gandalf was not, by the standards of his own kind, a hasty being, and he had learned over many centuries that the most important things reveal themselves only to those who are willing to wait through the long, uneventful stretches of time that precede revelation. He visited the Shire regularly across the years following the unexpected journey, observed Bilbo with the unhurried attention of someone conducting a study, without a predetermined conclusion, and allowed what he saw to accumulate. What he saw was this: that Bilbo did not age. This was not in itself impossible. There were rings in the world and other objects that could slow the passage of years on those who held them, and the elven rings in particular were known to preserve their bearers in a condition of extended vitality. But the elven rings were accounted for. Their locations and their bearers were not mysteries. The ring that Bilbo wore on a chain was not one of them, and its provenance, a game of riddles in the dark. A creature called Gollum, who had lost something he called his precious, sat in Gandalf's accumulating file of concerns with the quiet insistence of something that had not yet said everything it intended to say. He began, carefully, and without announcing his purpose to anyone, to research. The libraries of the wise were available to him, the archives of Minas Tirith, the long memory of the elves, the records kept in Rivendell with the thoroughness that is natural to a people for whom history is not a matter of books, but of personal recollection, and he moved through those resources with the patience of a scholar who does not yet know which document will answer his question, but who is prepared to read everything until he finds it. He was looking for rings. Specifically, he was looking for any account of a ring whose properties resembled what he had observed in Bilbo: the invisibility, the extended life, the quality of attachment that bordered on something darker than ordinary fondness. He was looking, though he was not yet ready to say this plainly even to himself, for any account that might connect the plain gold ring in Bilbo's possession to the long history of the one ring that Sauron had forged in the fires of Orodruin in the Second Age, and that was believed by those who kept such beliefs alive to have been lost in the waters of the Gladden Fields after Isildur's death. The search through the libraries was methodical and slow and produced, for years at a stretch, nothing that resolved his unease, which itself was a kind of data, the absence of a clean explanation keeping the question alive in the space where it needed to remain alive. And so Gandalf sat with his discomfort and visited the Shire, and watched Bilbo not age, and continued to turn the question over, patient as water, thorough as time, waiting for the stone to show him what was underneath. The libraries had not given him certainty, but they had given him the shape of a suspicion precise enough to test, and it was the nature of Gandalf's particular genius that he understood the difference between those two things, between the suspicion that requires more reading and the suspicion that requires an experiment, between the question that lives in documents and the question that can only be answered by fire. He had read everything the archives could offer him on the subject of the Great Rings, had moved through centuries of accumulated scholarship, with the thoroughness of someone who knows that the answer he's looking for may be hidden in a footnote, in a marginal notation, in the kind of detail that a less attentive reader would pass over without registering its weight. And what he had found was not proof but possibility. The possibility, grown gradually from the size of a splinter to the size of something he could no longer comfortably ignore. That the ring Bilbo Baggins had carried out of the Misty Mountains on an afternoon 60 years ago was not a lost trinket of minor enchantment, but something of an entirely different order of magnitude. He had come back to the Shire carrying that possibility the way one carries something fragile, carefully, without sudden movements, with the full attention of someone who understands that the object in their hands, if it is what they think it is, must not be dropped. Bag End received him as it always did, with the particular warmth of a hobbit hole that had been loved for a long time, and that showed that love in the accumulated detail of its furnishings, the deep chairs, the well-worn rugs, the smell of pipe smoke and old wood, and the faint sweetness of whatever Frodo had been cooking that afternoon. Frodo Baggins, Bilbo's heir in more senses than the merely legal one, was there to greet him, and Gandalf sat with him through the early evening with a patience that concealed entirely the urgency of what he had come to do. He had carried the knowledge for weeks, across the long road from Minas Tirith through the southern lands, and up through the Misty Mountains' western foothills, and through the gentle, familiar countryside of the Shire, and he had used those weeks to prepare himself for what the test might reveal, to sit with the worst possibility until it no longer had the power to destabilize him, because a destabilized Gandalf would be of no use to anyone in what was coming, and what was coming, if he was right, would require him to be entirely composed. He asked Frodo for the ring. The request was made in the tone of ordinary curiosity, the tone of an old wizard asking to examine something he has heard described, and Frodo produced it from the envelope in which Bilbo had left it, with a compliance that was entirely without suspicion, because there was nothing in Gandalf's manner to suggest that the moment was anything other than what it appeared to be. The ring sat in Gandalf's palm, gold and plain, and unremarkable in the way that the most dangerous things often are, and Gandalf looked at it for a long moment with the quality of attention that he brought to objects he wished to understand fully before he acted upon his understanding. Then he moved to the hearth. The fire was low and red in the way of evening fires that have been burning since afternoon, settled into comfortable coals rather than active flame, and Gandalf coaxed it higher with the ease of a long familiarity and held the ring in the fire's heart, held it there steadily, with the patience of someone who has decided to know the truth and who will not withdraw from the knowing before it is complete. The ring did not melt, not. Gold melts, even gold of the finest quality, in heat sustained and concentrated, but this gold sat in the flame as though the flame was simply another element it had learned to rest in without difficulty, as though the concept of heat did not apply to it in the way it applied to ordinary matter. And then, as the fire reached the particular intensity that Gandalf had been coaxing it toward, the letters appeared. They came up out of the surface of the ring as though they had always been there, written in a script of black speech that Gandalf recognized immediately, and that he had prayed, across the long road from Minas Tirith, that he would not recognize, the language of Mordor, the language of the enemy, the script in which the One Ring's inscription had been recorded in Isildur's account, and committed to the archives in Minas Tirith, in the careful hand of a man who had not survived long enough to understand what he had written down. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them. The words completed themselves in fire, and Gandalf withdrew the ring from the flame and sat in the silence that followed with the expression of a being who has just had confirmed for him the thing he most hoped would not be confirmed. The fire settled back to its evening rhythm, low and red and warm, entirely indifferent to what had just occurred beside it. The room was the same room it had always been, the deep chairs and the well-worn rugs and the smell of pipe smoke and old wood, and that ordinariness was its own particular quality in the moment after revelation. The way the world's refusal to register the significance of what has just happened in it can feel, depending on the circumstance, either like comfort or like accusation. Gandalf sat and allowed the knowledge to complete itself in him, to become fully real in the way that knowledge requires time to become real, even knowledge that has been anticipated and prepared for and carried across weeks of patient riding through the rain. He had been right. He had hoped to be wrong. The ring was the One Ring, and Frodo Baggins was sitting in the next room with no idea of what had just occurred, and the enemy was already, as Gandalf knew from other intelligence gathered over other long years of watching and waiting, beginning to stir in the east, beginning to reach outward with his attention toward the one thing that could restore him to his full power. What followed the confirmation was not panic, because Gandalf did not permit himself panic, but it was the closest thing to urgency that Gandalf's particular nature allowed. A sharpening of focus, a prioritization of the most immediate necessities over the longer work of comprehensive planning that would have to wait for a later hour. The most immediate necessity was Frodo. Frodo needed to understand what he held and what it meant, and he needed to understand it in a way that would prepare him to act rightly, rather than in a way that would simply frighten him into inaction, and the task of calibrating that communication fell entirely to Gandalf, who was the only person in the Shire, and one of very few people in all of Middle-earth who understood fully what the communication needed to contain. He went back to the fire, which was still burning, and he sat there for a long time before he called Frodo in, composing himself, organising the centuries of context that would need to be compressed into a single conversation without losing the essential truth of any of it. Then he spoke, and as he spoke, and watched Frodo receive what he was being told with the particular quality of steady attention that would come to seem, in retrospect, like the first evidence of the extraordinary character the road ahead would reveal, Gandalf felt the weight of what was coming settle onto the evening with the heaviness of something that had been waiting a very long time to arrive, and felt also, beneath that weight, the quiet endurance of someone who has spent many centuries preparing for exactly this moment, and who is, despite everything, not unprepared. The road south to Minas Tirith and then further, to whatever confirmation the archives might still offer, and whatever allies could yet be gathered, was already forming itself in his mind as he spoke, and the fire burned steadily in the hearth, and outside the windows of Bag End the Shire went on in its unhurried evening, entirely peaceful, entirely unaware, the stars coming out one by one above the hill as though this were a night like any other night, which it was not, and had not been for a very long time. The road south from the Shire was a road Gandalf had travelled many times in many weathers and many states of mind, but he had never travelled it carrying quite this particular weight, the weight not of uncertainty, which he had carried for decades and had learned to bear with something approaching equanimity, but of certainty, which is a different and in some ways heavier burden, because uncertainty leaves room for the possibility that the worst will not come to pass, while certainty closes that room quietly and permanently, and asks you to live in the smaller space that remains. He rode through the southern reaches of Eriador and through the long miles of Dunland and through the gap of Rohan, with the focused patience of someone who has accepted what is coming, and who is now engaged in the more practical work of understanding it fully, not the emotional work of acceptance which was already done, but the scholarly work of documentation, of finding every piece of the record that bore on the question and assembling those pieces into a shape complete enough to be presented to others who would need to understand it as clearly as he did. Minas Tirith was where the most important piece waited. He had known this since the night by Frodo's fire. The archives of the stewards of Gondor held something that no other repository in Middle-earth could offer, the direct testimony of Isildur himself, written in the days immediately following the defeat of Sauron at the end of the Second Age, the account of a man who had held the One Ring in his own hand and who had recorded what he observed with the precision of someone who understood, even then, that the record might matter. Minas Tirith received him in the manner it always received wandering wizards, with a respect that was not quite warmth, a formal courtesy that acknowledged his status without entirely knowing what to do with it. The city was beautiful in the way of things built to last, its 7 levels rising in tiers of pale stone against the shoulder of Mount Mindoluin. The White Tower catching the morning light with a particular quality of architecture that has been tended across centuries by people who understand themselves as inheritors and custodians rather than as owners. Gandalf moved through it with the briskness of someone who has not come for the beauty, though he noticed the beauty in the way he always noticed it, as something worth preserving, as one of the reasons the work mattered. He had come for the archives, and the archives were in the lowest and oldest level of the Tower of Ecthelion, in rooms that smelled of stone and old parchment, and the particular dry coolness of spaces that have been maintained at a careful temperature across many generations because the materials they contain are understood to be irreplaceable. The steward's archivist received him with the deference owed to a member of the Order of Wizards, which was considerable, and with the mild anxiety of archivists everywhere who are asked to produce specific documents from collections of very great age and complexity, which is also considerable, and after the appropriate amount of time spent in the appropriate amount of consultation among themselves, they led him to the section of the archive that contained the oldest Gondorian records, the accounts and documents produced in the years immediately following the Last Alliance, when Gondor was still a kingdom in its full strength, and the events of the War of the Last Alliance were still recent enough to be remembered by those who had participated in them. The document he was looking for was not difficult to find once he was in the right section, because the archivist knew their collection with the intimate familiarity of people who have spent their working lives in its company, and they produced it with a care that told him they understood its age even if they had not recently had occasion to consider its contents. It was a scroll, not a bound volume, older than the binding tradition, produced in the years when Gondor's scribal culture still used the scroll format that had come with the Númenórean settlers from the Western Isle, and written in a hand that Gandalf recognised as consistent with the late Second Age documents he had encountered in other archives, the particular formation of letters that scribes of that period had used before the gradual evolution of Gondorian script across the centuries of the Third Age had produced the forms that were current in Gandalf's own time. He unrolled it with the practised care of someone accustomed to handling objects whose physical integrity matters as much as their informational content, and he began to read. Isildur's account was written in the manner of a man accustomed to command, direct, precise, sparing of ornament, attentive to the details that he understood to be militarily and historically significant. He described the siege of Barad-dûr in terms that conveyed its duration and its cost without dwelling on either, moved through the account of the final battle on the slopes of Orodruin, with the economy of a commander writing a report rather than a chronicler writing for posterity, and then arrived at the moment that Gandalf had come to read about, the moment after Sauron's defeat, when the Dark Lord had been overthrown and the One Ring lay in Isildur's possession on the plain of the Samath Naur, with the fires of the mountain still burning below the ledge where he stood. What Isildur had written about the ring in those immediate hours was the closest thing to a first-hand scientific account of its properties that existed anywhere in the surviving record. And Gandalf read it with the full attention of someone extracting the maximum information from a source that cannot be asked follow-up questions. Isildur had noted the ring's temperature, that it was warm as a living thing, in the words he had committed to the scroll in his careful military hand. He had noted the inscription, which had been visible in the heat of the mountain, and which he had copied out in full, letter by letter, in the black speech that he apparently could read well enough to transcribe, even if he could not speak it with comfort. He had noted the weight, which was not the weight of gold alone, but seemed to his hand to carry something additional that was not physical in any ordinary sense. And he had noted the compulsion, the quality of attachment that had begun, he recorded with the honesty of a man taking a military inventory, to make itself felt within the first hours of his possession of the ring, the way the thought of destroying it had become, by the time he descended from the Sammath now to the plain below, a thought that felt not wrong exactly, but remote, as though it belonged to an earlier version of himself that the hour since the battle had already begun to supersede. He had not destroyed it. He had kept it, and ridden north, and been ambushed in the Gladden Fields, and died in the river, and the ring had passed from him into the water, and from the water into the long obscurity from which Bilbo Baggins had retrieved it, entirely without understanding what he held. On an afternoon in the mountains 60 years before, Gandalf sat in the archive in Minas Tirith, and read Isildur's words by the light of a lamp that one of the archivists had placed beside him, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who understands that important work requires good light. Near the end of the account, in a passage that dealt with the ring's markings and their significance, Isildur had used a name that he had apparently gathered from the questioning of prisoners taken after the battle, a name given to the ring by those who had served in Sauron's forces, and who had referred to it in whispers as the index of their master's continued existence and eventual return. The name was not the name of the ring itself, which Isildur recorded separately in its full Quenya form, but the name of the creature from whom, according to those prisoners, the ring had passed across a long chain of obscure possessions before arriving in the hands that had brought it to the Misty Mountains. That name was Smeagol. It sat in Isildur's account like a pebble in a stream, small, specific, apparently incidental, the kind of detail that a reader in a hurry might pass over without registering its significance. Gandalf did not pass over it. He read it once, and then he read it again, and he held it in his mind beside the other name for the same creature that he already knew, the name Bilbo had used when he had described his encounter in the dark, the name of the thing that had sat on its island and eaten fish, and asked riddles, and lost its precious to a hobbit who had not understood what he was taking. Gollum. The archive was very quiet around him, and the lamp burned steadily, and outside the deep walls of the Tower of Ecthelion, the city of Minas Tirith continued its patient, beautiful, unknowing life. Gandalf sat with the scroll in his hands and the name in his mind and understood, with the full weight of certainty that the night by Frodo's fire had begun, that the search he was about to undertake had now acquired its first and most necessary coordinate. The name Smeagol led backward through time the way all names lead backward through time, when you follow them with sufficient patience, not to a monster, not to the creature of darkness and obsession that the name Gollum had come to evoke in the minds of those few who knew it, but to something much older and much quieter, to a life that had begun in the ordinary way of lives, in a community and a family and a set of daily circumstances that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the centuries of isolation and diminishment that had followed. Gandalf had gathered what could be gathered about this history from the sources available to him, the long memory of the elves who had observed the movements of strange creatures through the margins of their lands, the accounts of rivermen and farmers in the Vale of Anduin who had noticed, across the generations, the occasional evidence of something small and furtive living in the vicinity of the Gladden Fields. And what emerged from that gathering was a portrait of origins so ordinary that their contrast with what followed them carried its own kind of sorrow, the sorrow of understanding exactly where the road had turned, and exactly how far it had gone in the wrong direction since the turning. The people from whom Smeagol came were hobbits, though they would not have used that word about themselves, or rather they were the ancestors of what would eventually become hobbits. one of the 3 hobbit strains that had existed in the early centuries of the Third Age in the Vale of Anduin before the migrations westward that would eventually produce the settled culture of the Shire. The Stores were the largest and most broad-bodied of the 3 strains, more comfortable with water than the other 2, more willing to settle in low-lying riverside country, more inclined toward the fishing and small boat navigation that the rivers of the Vale made possible. They were not a remarkable people in any sense that the wider histories of Middle-earth would have occasion to record. They farmed, they fished, they maintained the small social structures of a community that needed no outside authority to organise itself, and they lived in the Gladden Fields with the untroubled relationship to their landscape that comes from generations of knowing a place well enough to understand what it offers and what it requires in return. Smeagol was born into this community at some point in the early centuries of the Third Age, into a family whose position within the community was comfortable enough to have produced in him the social ease of someone who has never had reason to question his place, and he grew up in the way that people grow up in stable communities, learning the landscape, learning the social codes, forming the attachments and rivalries and curiosities that constitute a life before anything of significance has yet happened to it. He was, by the accounts that Gandalf could piece together from the fragmentary evidence available across the great distance of years, a curious creature even before the ring found him. Curious in the particular way of those who are drawn to the hidden things, to the roots beneath the surface, to the underside of stones and the dark places under riverbanks, where interesting things accumulate out of the sight of the less inquisitive. His grandmother was a figure of some standing in the community, a matriarch whose authority rested on the combination of longevity and accumulated practical wisdom that earns respect in small communities without the need for any formal structure to support it, and Smeagol appears to have had the kind of relationship with her that curious children sometimes have with their most formidable elder relatives, a mixture of genuine affection and competitive attention-seeking, the desire to be noticed and approved of by someone whose approval is not easily given. He had a cousin, Sméagol, who was his closest companion in the way that childhood companions become closest companions, through the simple and sufficient mechanism of proximity and shared time, through the accumulation of ordinary days spent doing ordinary things together until the relationship has acquired the weight that only accumulated time can give it. It was Sméagol who found the ring, and it is necessary to sit with that fact for a moment, to understand that the great and terrible history that flows from the finding did not begin with Smeagol's nature or Smeagol's weakness, but with a morning of fishing on a river, with the ordinary accident of a large fish pulling a hobbit off his small boat into the water of the Gladden Fields on a day that had begun like any other day. Sméagol went into the river and came up with the ring in his hand, the ring that had lain in the mud and silt of the Gladden Fields since the night Isildur had died in that same river nearly 25 centuries before, the ring that had been waiting in the cold dark of the riverbed with the patience of something that does not need air or light, or the company of living things, the ring that was, even in the mud at the bottom of a river in an unremarkable stretch of the Vale of Anduin, entirely and continuously itself. Sméagol surfaced and looked at what he had found, and saw a small gold ring of unusual brightness, and the brightness pleased him, and he held it with the innocent pleasure of someone who has found a pretty thing on an ordinary morning. What happened next is the hinge point of Smeagol's entire history, and it is a hinge point of a particular kind. Not the kind that announces itself as significant, not a moment of grand dramatic choice between clearly understood alternatives, but the kind that arrives wearing the ordinary clothes of a small social moment and reveals its true nature only in the light of everything that comes after it. Smeagol saw the ring in Sméagol's hand and wanted it with an immediacy and an intensity that was out of all proportion to the wanting that a pretty object ordinarily produces, wanted it with the specific quality of desire that the ring was capable of generating in susceptible natures, a desire that arrived not as an addition to ordinary consciousness, but as a replacement of it, as though the part of him that would normally have contextualized the want within the framework of social obligation and affection for his cousin had simply been set aside for the duration. He asked Sméagol for the ring as a birthday present. It was, by the accounting of his family, his birthday, and the birthday present tradition gave him a social hook on which to hang the asking. Sméagol refused, and Smeagol killed him. The killing was not premeditated. It was the act of a mind that had been temporarily reorganized around a single imperative by an object of power that had, in the 25 centuries of its residence in the riverbed, lost none of its capacity for exactly this kind of reorganization. This does not excuse it, and Gandalf, turning the history over in the quiet of his own long reflection, did not reach for excuses on Smeagol's behalf, because excuses would have been a lesser kind of honesty than the one the story deserved. What the story deserved was understanding, the recognition that what happened on the bank of the Gladden Fields that morning was the first and in some ways the most important demonstration in the entire history of the Third Age of what the One Ring actually was and what it actually did, and that Smeagol was not a uniquely weak or uniquely wicked creature, but simply the first in a long line of beings who would discover that the ring's particular form of corruption does not require a corrupt nature to take hold, only a nature and the proximity of the ring, and a moment in which the ordinary social scaffolding of a life is briefly insufficient to support the weight of what is being asked of it. The community cast him out. His grandmother, the matriarch whose approval he had spent his life seeking, told him to leave and not return, and he left, took himself and the ring into the margins of the world, into the cave systems of the Misty Mountains where he would spend the next 500 years in the slow dissolution that the ring's influence, sustained across that extraordinary length of time, was fully capable of producing. He went into the mountains a hobbit, and he came out of them, 5 centuries later, something that retained the memory of having been a hobbit without retaining much else of what that had meant. The ring extended his life far beyond any natural span, as it had extended Bilbo's after him, but it did not preserve him in health. It preserved him in a state of arrested diminishment, keeping him alive and keeping his connection to the ring's will intact, while allowing everything else about him to erode slowly toward a condition that was barely recognizable as the thing it had started from. He called the ring his precious, and he called himself Gollum, and he sat on his island in the cold underground lake and ate fish, and occasionally, when fish were not sufficient, other things, and the centuries passed above him without his awareness of them in any meaningful sense, and the ring waited in his possession with the same patience it had demonstrated in the riverbed, waiting for the moment when it would find a way to move again, as it always found a way to move again, because the ring was not a passive object but an active will, and its will was always and entirely oriented toward return. The mountains had been his world for so long that the absence of them, when it came, was itself a kind of wound, not the clean wound of a sudden loss but the slow, disorienting wound of a creature removed from the only context in which it had learned to function, set down in a wider world that it had forgotten how to read. Gollum had lived beneath the Misty Mountains for approximately 500 years when Bilbo Baggins stumbled into his tunnels on the afternoon that changed everything, and in those 5 centuries the world above had continued its business of change and conflict, and the slow rearrangement of power without consulting him, without his awareness, without leaving any impression on the cold underground existence in which he had become so thoroughly embedded that the cave and the lake and the fish and the darkness had ceased to be his circumstances and had become, in every meaningful sense, himself. He had gone into the mountains a creature still tethered, however tenuously, to the social world of living things. He came out of them with that tether so thoroughly frayed as to be effectively gone, and what remained in its place was the single filament of connection that the ring had maintained in him across the centuries, the connection to his precious, which was now absent, which had been taken from him by a small creature with large feet, who had answered his riddles correctly and vanished into the dark with the thing that Gollum had organized his entire diminished existence around possessing. The loss was not a loss he was equipped to process in any ordinary way, because the psychological architecture that ordinary loss requires, the capacity to grieve, to reorient, to eventually find new purpose, had been so thoroughly restructured by 5 centuries of the ring's influence that what remained in him when the ring was gone was closer to a wound that could not close than to anything that might eventually heal. He emerged from the eastern gate of the mountains in a condition that could be described, from the outside, as purposeful. He had a direction, which was the direction the ring had gone, and a goal, which was recovery of the ring. But the purpose was entirely the ring's rather than his own, the last active instruction that the ring had lodged in him before its departure, running in him like a command issued to a mechanism rather than a desire entertained by a person. He moved east and then south, and then in various other directions as rumour and instinct and the faint attenuated sensitivity to the ring's presence that 5 centuries of proximity had built into him pulled him across the landscape in a search that had no clear methodology, but that was never entirely without direction, because the ring left traces in the world through which it passed. Traces that Gollum could feel in the way that a creature adapted to darkness can feel gradations of dark that are invisible to those accustomed to the light. The years of wandering that followed Gollum's emergence from the mountains were years during which the wider world had, from his perspective, very little reality beyond its utility as the medium through which the search was conducted. He moved through landscapes without registering them as landscapes. They were simply the terrain between his current position and the position of his precious, varying in their difficulty and their danger, but not in their fundamental nature as obstacles to be navigated rather than places to be inhabited. He passed through the eastern foothills of the Misty Mountains, through the brown lands east of the Anduin, where the grasslands stretched flat and featureless toward the horizon, through the margins of territories that were not safe for a small and singular creature moving alone. And he survived these passages with the particular cunning of something that has learned to make itself invisible, not through magic, but through the absolute minimization of its presence. Moving at night, resting in the deepest available concealment during the day, eating whatever was available and edible without the luxury of preference, maintaining the near-total silence that 5 centuries of underground life had made second nature. He was not, during these years, entirely without awareness of the world through which he moved, and what awareness he retained was organized almost entirely around threat assessment, the identification of things that might harm him, and the calculation of the minimum necessary action to avoid them. Sauron's servants were moving through the eastern lands with increasing frequency and increasing boldness, as the shadow in the east gathered itself toward the form it would eventually take. And Gollum navigated around these movements with a care that was not political or ideological, but simply practical. The care of a creature that wished to survive long enough to recover what it had lost, and that understood, at some level below articulation, that the servants of the shadow represented a specific danger to something as singular and as obviously associated with the ring as himself. He had been near Sauron's realm before, had spent time in the shadows of Mordor's borders in the early decades of his wandering, drawn there by the faint pull of the ring's resonance with the land that had made it, and he had felt there something that even his diminished consciousness could recognize as a form of recognition, the sense of being noticed by an attention of great power and particular interest, and he had fled from that recognition westward with a fear that was visceral even in a creature that had lost most of its other instincts. The Dead Marshes drew him eventually, as they drew many things that preferred the margins of the world to its centres, that vast, flat, fog-shrouded expanse of bog and shallow water that lay between the Emyn Muil and the gates of Mordor, a landscape that was inhospitable to most living things, but that offered, for a creature of Gollum's particular adaptations, a tolerable combination of concealment and sustenance. He had been in and around the marshes for some years, living in the way he had always lived, catching fish in the still pools, avoiding the paths that the servants of the shadow used on their movements, between Mordor and the western lands, maintaining the near-total invisibility that was his primary survival strategy. When the growing intensity of his sensitivity to the ring's location began to resolve itself from a general directionality into something more specific, began to suggest not merely that the ring was somewhere in the western lands, but that it was somewhere in the western lands that had a name, a character, a particular quality that he could feel from a distance as a kind of warmth, the warmth of a place where small creatures lived in the particular quality of comfort and belonging that Gollum remembered, at the very bottom of whatever he still retained of Sméagol. As the quality of home. It was during these same years that something else was changing in the eastern lands, something that Gollum registered only in its effects, in the way that a creature living in the margins of events registers the events themselves, through the secondary disturbances they create rather than through any direct perception of their causes. The servants of the shadow were moving differently. Their patrols were wider, their attention was more focused, and the quality of the watching that had always been present in the lands round Mordor had shifted from the passive vigilance of a power maintaining its position to the active searching of a power that was looking for something specific, and that had reason to believe the thing it was looking for was findable. What they were looking for, what Sauron had begun to understand through his own long processes of reasoning and recovery, might be found if the right questions were asked of the right creatures, was the same thing Gollum was looking for, and the same thing Gandalf had confirmed in the fire of Frodo's hearth, and the same thing that sat in the pocket of a young hobbit in the Shire who had no idea that the attention of so many different and so variously motivated searchers had begun, in the way that attention always eventually does, to converge. Gollum did not know this in any articulate sense. He knew only the pull and the search, and the long nights of movement through a landscape that registered to him as nothing more than the space between himself and what he had lost. But the world around him was waking to the same question he had been living inside for decades, and the convergence that would eventually bring him face to face with that question's answer, and with the ranger who was already being tasked with finding him, was already, in the slow and patient way of historical inevitabilities, beginning to take shape. The convergence that had been taking shape in the shadows of the eastern lands required, on the western side of the equation, a particular kind of person, not a person of great armies or institutional authority, not someone whose power resided in the ability to compel others to act, but someone who could move through the unmapped spaces of the world with the patience and the self-sufficiency of a creature as solitary as the one being sought. Someone whose understanding of wilderness was not the understanding of a traveller passing through, but the understanding of a being for whom the wild places were simply home. Gandalf had known for some time who that person was. He had known it in the way he knew most of the things that mattered, not through a single moment of revelation, but through the long accumulation of observation across years of attention, through watching a young man grow into the full weight of an inheritance that would have broken a lesser nature and finding instead that the weight had produced in him something refined and resilient, and entirely suited to the work that the age was going to require of him. The man's name, in the common usage of the Dunedain who followed him, was Aragorn. He had other names, older names that carried the full freight of the lineage he represented, but in the years of the hunt he was known most simply as Strider, the name that the people of the Breelands used for the weathered rangers, who appeared occasionally in their inns and their market towns, and whose business was never entirely explained and never entirely comfortable to inquire about. Their relationship had begun when Aragorn was young by the reckoning of the Dunedain, whose blood carried enough of the old Númenorian longevity to make the word mean something different than it meant among ordinary men. Gandalf had sought him out in Rivendell, where Aragorn had been raised under the guardianship of Elrond, raised without full knowledge of his own name and lineage in the careful protective arrangement that Elrond and the surviving Dunedain chieftains had devised to keep the last heir of Isildur alive through a childhood that would have been dangerous if the child's identity had been widely known. Gandalf had watched him there, had watched the boy who would become the ranger develop under Elrond's tutelage with the attention of someone taking a very long measurement, assessing not merely what was present, but what the present qualities suggested about what the future would produce. What he had seen had satisfied him, and what the following decades had continued to produce had confirmed the satisfaction, and by the time the question of Gollum's location became a question that required active pursuit, Gandalf had already known for many years that the pursuit, if it was to be conducted properly, would need to be conducted by Aragorn. The conversation in which the task was assigned was not, by the standards of dramatic moments in the histories of great ages, a remarkable conversation. It took place in the way that many of Gandalf and Aragorn's most consequential conversations took place, in transit, in the margins of other business, in one of the meetings between the wandering wizard and the ranging chieftain, that occurred with the irregular frequency of two beings who move through the same general territory, without fixed schedules, and who encounter each other when the territory arranges it. Gandalf explained what he knew: the ring, the confirmation in the archive, the name Smeagol, the connection to the creature Bilbo had encountered in the mountains, the likelihood that Gollum was somewhere in the eastern wilderness conducting the same search that his proximity to the ring had made inevitable. He explained what he needed: someone to find Gollum before Sauron's servants did, to bring him in if possible, to learn from him, if that could be arranged, what he knew about the ring's history and the ring's location, because Gollum had held the ring for nearly 5 centuries, and whatever impressions the ring had left in him might be the most direct evidence available of its nature and its specific properties. He explained, with the plainness that characterized his communications with Aragorn at their best, that he did not know how long the search would take or precisely where it would need to go, and that it would need to be conducted in addition to the ordinary ranging work that Aragorn was already doing, rather than as a replacement for it. Because the Dunedain watch on the borders of the Shire and the other settled lands could not be reduced simply because an additional task had been added to the list of necessary things. Aragorn received this with the quality of attention that Gandalf had come to recognise as one of his most significant characteristics. A stillness in the listening that was not passivity, but the active engagement of someone who is processing information at a level deeper than its surface content, who is already, while the words are still being spoken, building the operational picture that will eventually become a plan. He asked the questions that needed asking, about the geography of Gollum's probable movements, about the specific markers that might help distinguish the traces of Gollum's passage from the traces of the other strange creatures that inhabited the margins of the eastern wilderness, about what Gandalf understood of Gollum's psychology and the patterns of behaviour that 5 centuries of a particular kind of existence might be expected to have produced. The questions were practical and precise and revealed, in their precision, the quality of mind that had been at work during the listening, a mind that moved naturally from information to implication, that understood the task not as a simple assignment, but as a complex problem requiring the integration of multiple kinds of knowledge, only some of which Gandalf could provide, and the rest of which would have to be assembled from the evidence of the search itself. What made Aragorn the right person for this work went beyond the obvious qualifications: the wilderness skill, the physical endurance, the capacity for the long solitary movement through difficult country that the search would require. It went to something more fundamental about the character that the years had formed in him, something that had to do with the particular relationship to purpose that the long inheritance of the Dunedain had made possible. He had been told at the age of 20 the full truth of his lineage, that he was Aragorn's son of Arathorn, the heir of Isildur, the last descendant of the kings of Gondor and Arnor in the direct line, and he had received that knowledge with the gravity of someone who understands immediately that knowing a thing and being prepared for all that knowing it will require are 2 different states separated by a great deal of work that only time can accomplish. He had spent the decades since that revelation engaged in exactly that work, ranging, learning, fighting when necessary, watching, building the knowledge of the world and of himself that the role demanded. The search for Gollum was, in this sense, continuous with everything else he'd been doing. Another expression of the long, patient preparation that his life had become. Another form of the watching and the waiting that was the essential discipline of the age. There was also between them, beneath the practical exchange of information and instruction, the quality of relationship that had developed across the years of their association. A relationship built on the particular foundation of 2 beings who understand themselves to be engaged in the same long work from different positions within it, who trust each other's judgment in the areas where their respective knowledge is deepest, and who have developed, through the accumulated experience of many conversations and many shared assessments of difficult situations, the kind of shorthand that makes communication between them more efficient than communication between strangers could ever be. Gandalf did not need to explain to Aragorn why the search mattered in its deepest sense. Aragorn had been living with the weight of the ring's history, with the specific gravity of Isildur's failure and its consequences for his own lineage and his own responsibility, for long enough that the explanation would have been redundant. He understood. And his understanding was of the kind that produces not paralysis but action, not the freezing weight of impossible obligation, but the steadying quality of a person who has accepted what is being asked, and who intends, with the full commitment of a nature shaped for exactly this kind of acceptance, to do it. He departed into the wilderness with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who has learned that the work of years cannot be rushed into the work of days without losing something essential in the compression. And Gandalf watched him go with the combination of confidence and concern that had characterized his relationship to Aragorn since the beginning. Confidence in the quality of the person, concern for the difficulty of what the person was being asked to carry. The eastern lands were wide and dangerous, and the creature being sought was small and cunning, and had been surviving in those margins for years without detection, and the search, Gandalf understood, might take longer than either of them wished and might require of Aragorn a quality of patience that would test even his considerable reserves. But the search had to be made, and the person making it was the right person, and the night was quiet around Gandalf as he turned his own road in a different direction, carrying the knowledge of what had been set in motion with the particular solemnity of someone who has just committed another piece of the age's great unfinished work to the care of a person worthy of it. The wilderness that received Aragorn as he departed into it was not a single landscape but a succession of them, each with its own character and its own demands, each requiring of the person moving through it a different calibration of the skills that ranging had built into him across the decades of his adult life. He had been moving through difficult country since his early 20s, had been learning the particular grammar of the wild places, the way weather announces itself in the behaviour of birds before it arrives in the sky, the way water reveals the passage of living things in the softness of its banks, the way the quality of silence in a landscape changes when something is present in it that is not ordinarily present. And he had reached, by the time Gandalf assigned him the search, the point in a ranger's development where this grammar was no longer something he consulted consciously, but something he simply read, the way a person who has spoken a language since childhood reads it without thinking about the reading. The search for Gollum would ask him to read that grammar with greater sustained attention than he had ever brought to it, across a greater extent of territory and a longer span of time than any previous ranging had required. And he accepted this demand with the equanimity of someone who has never expected the important work to be easy, and who has spent the better part of his life arranging his character so that difficulty does not become an argument against proceeding. The first years of the search established the pattern that the following decade would repeat and deepen, the systematic coverage of the territories most consistent with what Gandalf had described of Gollum's probable movements, the careful attention to the specific signs that might distinguish Gollum's passage from the passage of other creatures, and the gradual accumulation of negative evidence that is itself a form of positive knowledge, the knowledge of where the quarry is not, which narrows the question of where the quarry is, with the same efficiency as a direct sighting if it is gathered comprehensively enough. Aragorn moved through the eastern foothills of the Misty Mountains first, working systematically through the areas immediately adjacent to the mountain's eastern exits, looking for the traces of a creature that had been living underground for 5 centuries and that would have emerged into the outside world with the particular disorientation of something relearning a landscape it had forgotten. He found signs, small signs, the kind that required knowing what to look for, of something moving through the terrain in a pattern inconsistent with the movement of ordinary wildlife, something that chose concealment over efficiency in a way that suggested the concealment was a practiced strategy rather than an occasional instinct. The trail, when it was present, was the trail of a creature that moved at night and rested in the deepest available cover during the day, that fed in the vicinity of water, and that showed, in the places where it had rested long enough to leave more substantial evidence of its presence, the particular quality of habitation of something that had not entirely learned to be comfortable in the open air after very long confinement. The fish bones were the most consistent marker, the remains of raw fish eaten in the manner of a creature that has been eating raw fish for so long that the idea of preparing food differently has ceased to have any meaning. Small neat piles of bones in the deep shelter of overhanging banks or dense undergrowth that told Aragorn, each time he found them, that he was in the right general territory even when the creature itself was nowhere visible. He followed these traces east and then south across the brown lands, through the margins of Rhûn where the flat grasslands provided very little cover and where the signs of Gollum's passage became sparser and more widely spaced, suggesting movement made quickly and anxiously through terrain that offered insufficient concealment to allow the kind of extended rest the creature needed. The landscape of the search was one of the great unremarked geographies of Middle-earth, not the dramatically beautiful country of the Elven realms or the Shire or the mountain passes that the histories tended to describe, but the wide, unglamorous, genuinely difficult country of the east and south, the territories that appeared on maps, if they appeared at all, as undifferentiated space between the named places. The lands that the settled peoples of the west knew primarily as the directions from which danger sometimes came. Aragorn moved through this country with the attention it deserved, and the respect that long experience in difficult terrain had taught him. The flat plains where the wind came from all directions at once, and where the only shelter was the shallow depressions of old streambeds, the scrubland of the Harad borders, where the vegetation was sufficient for concealment, but the heat made sustained movement exhausting, the river margins of the southern Anduin, where the mud recorded everything that passed through it, with the thoroughness of a natural archive. He was thorough because the alternative to thoroughness was to miss something, and missing something, in a search of this particular consequence, was not acceptable. The years accumulated around the search the way years accumulate around any long-sustained effort, not dramatically. Not with the feeling of time passing, in the way that eventful time passes, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible weight of seasons repeated, of the same stars seen from different positions in the same general territory, of the gradual deepening of knowledge about a landscape that comes only from having moved through it in all weathers and all conditions across enough cycles of the year that the variations cease to be surprising, and become simply the known character of the place. Aragorn ranged during this period across a territory of extraordinary breadth, from the feet of the Misty Mountains to the borders of Rhûn in the east, from the northern edges of Mirkwood to the margins of the Harad in the south, a range that would have been impossible for a man of ordinary constitution, an ordinary commitment, but that he maintained with the stamina of someone whose Númenórean blood gave him a physical resilience that ordinary men did not possess, and whose sense of purpose gave that physical resilience somewhere adequate to go. He was not always exclusively searching for Gollum. The ordinary business of the Dúnedain Watch required his attention simultaneously, and he gave it that attention because the watch was not a lesser obligation simply because a greater one had been added to it, but the search ran beneath everything else he did with the continuous low-level focus of something that had been assigned to the part of his attention that does not rest, the part that continues to work through all other activities, turning the available evidence over and over in the quiet back rooms of a mind that never entirely stops. There were long stretches, sometimes of years, when the trail went cold in the sense that no new evidence of Gollum's movements could be found, when the territory Aragorn was covering yielded nothing beyond the negative confirmation that Gollum was not currently present in it. These stretches required of him a quality that is in some ways more difficult than the quality required by active difficulty, the quality of continuing to look without the reinforcement of finding, of maintaining the systematic attention of the search through the long, uneventful periods when the search produced nothing visible to justify its continuation. He managed this because he understood the mathematics of comprehensive searching, understood that the absence of evidence in a given territory was itself evidence of a kind, that the gradual elimination of the places where Gollum was not was narrowing, however slowly, the question of where Gollum was, and that the answer to that question was important enough to justify any length of patient negative work before it was reached. He did not permit himself discouragement in the sense of the feeling that produces abandonment, because abandonment was not among the options available to him in the situation as he understood it. What kept him at the work, through the cold stretches and the wide uneventful territories, and the years that produced little visible progress, was not merely discipline, though discipline was present, the deep disciplined quality that his years of preparation had built into the structure of his character, but something more intimate and more sustaining than discipline alone. He understood, in the way that only a person shaped by the specific history of his lineage could understand, what was at stake in the recovery of the ring, and the containing of the knowledge of its location. He was the heir of the man who had taken the ring from Sauron's hand and had not destroyed it, and he carried that inheritance not as shame. He was too clear-eyed about the nature of the ring's influence for shame to be the appropriate response to Isildur's failure, but as a form of obligation, a debt of the lineage that expressed itself in the daily practice of doing what the situation required regardless of the personal cost of the doing. The search was, in this deepest sense, simply what the age asked of him at this particular moment, and he gave it what the age asked with the complete commitment of someone who has never believed that the important work could be done by anyone other than the person it had been given to. And the eastern lands held their secrets patiently around him, and the seasons turned, and the trail, after years of coldness, began somewhere near the margins of the Dead Marshes to warm again, slowly at first, then with a gathering specificity that told him, in the grammar of the wilderness that he had spent his life learning to read, that the long search was moving at last toward its conclusion. The warming of the trail near the Dead Marshes was not a sudden thing. It was the gradual clarification of something that had been present at the edge of legibility for some time, like a shape in fog that resolves itself not in a single moment of revelation, but through the slow accretion of detail as the distance between the observer and the observed decreases one careful step at a time. Aragorn had been working the margins of the marshes for several weeks, when the signs began to concentrate in the way that signs concentrate when a creature has settled into a territory rather than simply passing through it. The fish bones appearing with greater frequency, the disturbances in the soft mud of the marsh edges forming a pattern consistent with regular movement between specific points rather than the irregular passage of something in transit. the quality of the concealment sites suggesting a creature that had assessed the available shelter with the thoroughness of long residence rather than the quick pragmatism of an overnight stop. Gollum was here, or had been here recently enough that the distinction between presence and very recent absence was, for the purposes of the search, not a meaningful one. The trail that had been cold for months was warm, and Aragorn reduced his own pace and his own visibility in direct proportion to the warming, moving through the landscape with the particular quality of care that the final approach to a quarry requires, the care that understands that the last distance is the most dangerous distance, the one most likely to produce the mistake that undoes the entire preceding work. The Dead Marshes were, as landscape, among the most inhospitable territories Aragorn had moved through in the full extent of his ranging, not inhospitable in the way of high mountain passes or exposed northern plains, which present their difficulty openly and allow the person moving through them to prepare accordingly, but inhospitable in the specific way of terrain that conceals its dangers beneath a surface of deceptive ordinariness, that looks from a distance like simply wet, flat, unpleasant country, and reveals its true character only to those already committed to its interior. The marsh extended for many miles in every direction, a vast, flat expanse of shallow water and soft ground, and the particular grey-green vegetation that thrives in places where the boundary between land and water is permanently ambiguous, shot through with channels of dark water that had no consistent depth and that could not be trusted to bear weight from one crossing to the next, and threaded throughout with the paths that only a creature intimately familiar with their specific geography could navigate with confidence. The faces in the water were there, the ancient dead of the Battle of Dagorlad, preserved in some quality of the marsh's dark water that was not entirely natural, their pale features visible beneath the surface in the still pools, with the quality of things that have been waiting a very long time for something to look at them. Aragorn moved past these with the matter-of-fact equanimity of a ranger who has encountered the strange things of the world often enough that strangeness itself is no longer a disruption to the work. He found Gollum on the third night of the concentrated search, in the way that many things are found when they are found at last. Not dramatically, not with the quality of climax that the preceding years of searching might have seemed to demand, but quietly, almost anticlimactically, the way the end of a long-sustained effort often arrives in a register that is entirely disproportionate to the magnitude of what has preceded it. Gollum was in the shelter of a dense stand of marsh grass at the edge of one of the larger channels, crouched over the remains of a fish, with the focused absorption of a creature that has been eating alone for so long that eating has lost any social dimension it might once have had and become purely a physical transaction between the animal and its sustenance. He had not heard Aragorn's approach, or if he had heard something, he had not correctly identified it as the approach of a person, rather than the ordinary ambient sound of the marsh settling into itself in the late hours of the night. The marsh was full of sounds, the movement of water through channels, the occasional cry of a night bird, the soft, persistent sound of things growing and decomposing in the wet, and Aragorn had used those sounds as cover in the way that a skilled ranger uses the available environment, moving when the marsh moved, pausing when it paused, arriving at the position from which the capture was possible, with a patience that had taken hours, and that Gollum's absorption in his meal had finally made complete. The capture itself was not a contest in any ordinary sense. Gollum was not a creature of physical power. 5 centuries of underground living, and the progressive diminishment that the ring's influence had produced had left him with the strength of something that has survived rather than thrived, wiry and unexpectedly quick, but not capable of sustained resistance against someone of Aragorn's size and skill. What he had instead of power was the instinctive evasiveness of a creature that has spent its entire post-mountain existence avoiding exactly this kind of contact, the reflex speed of something that has learned to treat every approach as a threat, and that has developed, over decades of practice, the capacity to disappear into available cover with a rapidity that was startling in something of his apparent frailty. Aragorn had anticipated this, had positioned himself between Gollum and the most obvious escape routes before he made his presence known, and when Gollum bolted, the immediate electric bolt of pure animal fear, all the accumulated instinct of years of solitary survival firing at once in a single explosive movement. The routes he reached for were already closed. What followed was brief and, in its way, careful. careful on Aragorn's part, which is to say, that the binding of Gollum's hands and the management of his initial wild resistance were accomplished with the minimum of force consistent with the security of the capture, with the specific restraint of someone who understands that the creature being subdued is not an enemy in the ordinary sense, but something that has been profoundly damaged by forces larger than itself, and that additional damage is not the goal. Gollum screamed, a thin, terrible sound, the sound of a creature in whom the experience of being physically restrained triggered something older and deeper than the immediate situation, some memory of loss and dispossession that the contact of another person's hands had unlocked, and the sound went out across the marshes and was absorbed by them without echo, the way the marshes absorbed everything, without comment and without record. Aragorn spoke to him, quietly and without threat in his voice, in the way that he had learned to speak to frightened things, not with false reassurance, which frightened things can always detect as false, but with the plain, steady tone of someone who is present, and who intends to remain present, and who is not going to inflict more discomfort than the situation requires. Gollum did not calm exactly, but he subsided. The screaming diminished to a low, continuous muttering, and the physical resistance exhausted itself against the restraint and gave way to the shivering stillness of something that has used everything it has and found it insufficient. Aragorn looked at him in the marsh darkness, and saw what the years of searching had been searching for, and what he saw produced in him not triumph. Triumph was not a response his nature made available to him in this kind of situation, but something more complex and more sombre, the specific quality of feeling that comes from looking at something ruined and understanding, with full clarity, what the ruin cost and what it represents. Gollum was ancient in a way that had nothing to do with dignity. The centuries of the ring's influence had stretched his life far beyond its natural span while consuming almost everything that life had once contained, leaving behind the residue of a personality that retained the memory of having been a person without retaining, in any coherent form, the substance of personhood. His eyes caught the faint light that filtered through the marsh grass, the pale, luminous quality of eyes that have adapted completely to darkness and that find even the low ambient light of a cloudy night more than sufficient, and in those eyes, alongside the fear and the hatred and the desperate acquisitive grief that the loss of the ring had embedded in him as permanently as anything about him was permanent, there was something else, something faint and deeply buried and perhaps not even correctly described as the thing it resembled, but there nonetheless, the faintest residual trace of the creature that had existed before the ring had found him, before Sméagol had surfaced from the Gladden Fields, with gold in his hand on a birthday morning long ago, before the long ruin had begun. It was not enough to build anything on, but it was enough, in the reckoning of someone who understood both mercy and its limits, to matter. Aragorn bound him with the gentleness the situation permitted and prepared for the long road north, carrying with him the conclusion of 17 years of searching and the beginning of a new and different question, not where Gollum was, which was answered, but what was to be done with him now, which was a question that would require different counsel than a ranger moving alone through the wilderness was positioned to provide. The marshes settled back into their night sounds around them, indifferent and patient, and the faces in the dark water continued their long waiting beneath the surface, and overhead the clouds moved slowly across a sky that held no stars visible, but that held them nonetheless, burning in their patient distances, entirely unchanged by what had just occurred below them, as the stars are unchanged by everything, holding their ancient light across the long separation of the heavens from the affairs of the small, consequential, irreplaceable creatures that move through the world beneath them. The road north from the Dead Marshes was the longest road Aragorn had walked in all the years of the search, and it was the longest not in the sense of distance. He had covered greater distances in the ranging years, had moved through wider territories with less certainty of destination, but in the sense of sustained attention, the quality of alertness that travelling with a prisoner requires when the prisoner is not a prisoner in any ordinary sense, but something between a captive and a patient, something that needed to be kept secure without being broken further than it was already broken, something that resisted with every available means and yet inspired in its captor by the very completeness of its ruin, a care that mere security would not have demanded on its own. Gollum did not travel willingly. This was not a surprise. Nothing in his history suggested a capacity for willingness in circumstances not of his own choosing. but the specific character of his unwillingness revealed itself across the early days of the journey in ways that required constant management, constant recalibration of the approach. He pulled against his bonds with the persistence of something that has not yet accepted the physical reality of its situation, that continues to test the constraint long after the test should have yielded a definitive result, as though the repetition of the attempt might eventually produce a different outcome. He spoke to himself in the low, continuous muttering that Aragorn had heard first in the marshes, the two-voiced internal dialogue of a fractured consciousness addressing itself across the division that centuries of isolation had opened in it, and the content of the muttering oscillated between the grief of loss and the cold calculation of recovery, between my precious, gone, and the quieter, more dangerous register of a mind still turning over the question of how the precious might be regained. The landscape through which they moved in the first weeks was the landscape of the approach to Mordor inverted, the Dead Marshes receding behind them, the Emyn Muil rising ahead in their broken maze-like configuration of ridges and gullies that provided excellent cover for a ranger who knew how to use them, but that also presented the specific navigational challenge of terrain with no straight lines, terrain that requires constant small decisions about route, and that punishes inattention with the particular punishment of the lost hour, the backtrack, the gully that looked passable from above and proved impassable at its floor. Aragorn moved through the Emyn Muil with the competence of someone who had ranged these hills before, using the cover they offered, and managing Gollum's movement through the more difficult passages with the combination of patience and firmness that the terrain and the prisoner together demanded. He did not hurry. Hurrying with Gollum was not possible in any case. The creature moved in the particular way of something that has spent centuries on all fours in low tunnels, with a speed and agility across broken ground that was, in the conditions it chose, considerable, but that needed to be managed carefully when the conditions were not of its choosing, when the direction of movement was imposed rather than elected, and when the instinct to bolt was being held in check only by the restraint of the cord and the steady presence of the ranger at the other end of it. There were moments. In the long evenings when the day's movement had stopped and camp had been made in whatever shelter the landscape offered, when something resembling communication became possible between them. These moments were rare and fragile and never entirely comfortable, but they were present, and Aragorn attended to them with the full seriousness of someone who understood that Gollum's testimony, not forced testimony, not the testimony of a creature in pain, but the voluntary disclosure of a mind that had been treated with sufficient consistency and sufficient patience to arrive, occasionally at something like trust, might eventually yield information of the kind that Gandalf needed. He did not press these moments. Pressing would have closed them. He allowed them instead to develop at the pace they developed at, which was very slow, and he accepted what they offered without expressing the satisfaction that might have encouraged calculation on Gollum's part, because Gollum was a calculating creature, and would have recognized and exploited any sign that his interlocutor was invested in obtaining specific information. The conversations that resulted were fragmentary and oblique, and required, on Aragorn's part, the kind of interpretive patience that reads meaning in what is not said as attentively as in what is, that understands the shape of a subject by the consistent way in which a speaker circles around it without approaching it directly. What Gollum gave him, in these fragments, confirmed what Gandalf had suspected, that Gollum's connection to the ring was not merely historical but ongoing, that the sensitivity to its presence that 5 centuries of proximity had built into him was still active, still oriented, still producing in him the directional awareness of something that knows where the thing it seeks is located even when it cannot name the location in terms that a map would recognize. The northern route took them through the western edges of the Brownlands, and then up along the line of the Anduin, keeping to the eastern bank where the cover was denser and the likelihood of encountering travellers was lower. Aragorn was not attempting to conceal the journey from Gandalf or from those who would eventually need to know about it, but he was attempting to conceal it from the other interested parties, the servants of the Shadow, whose movements through the eastern lands had been intensifying in the period since Frodo's departure from the Shire, and who would have a very specific interest in the small, ancient creature that Aragorn was conducting northward through the wilderness. The Shadow's awareness of Gollum's significance was not certain, but it was probable. Sauron was not unintelligent about the history of his own ring, and a creature that had held the ring for nearly 5 centuries, and that was now in the custody of a Dúnedain ranger. Moving toward the settled lands of the west was the kind of intelligence asset that any sufficiently attentive power would attempt to intercept if it became aware of what was in transit. Aragorn managed the route with this possibility in mind, choosing the less obvious paths, varying the pace and timing of movement to avoid the patterns that surveillance can track, using the natural cover of the river country with the thoroughness of a ranger who has been evading hostile attention in difficult terrain for most of his adult life. As the weeks of travel extended into months, and the route curved northward and westward through the gradual transition from the brown and featureless eastern country to the greener, more varied landscape of Wilderland, something shifted in the quality of Gollum's behaviour that Aragorn noticed without remarking on, filed alongside the other evidence he was accumulating without allowing it to change the essential character of his treatment of the prisoner. Gollum was, very slowly and very partially, becoming accustomed to the journey. Not reconciled to it, reconciliation was too strong a word for what was occurring, but accustomed in the sense that a creature adapts to any sustained circumstance that it cannot alter, that finds in the consistency of the new situation something it can orient itself within, even when the situation itself remains unwelcome. He still muttered, and he still pulled against the cord, and he still looked at Aragorn with the combination of fear and calculation that had been his primary mode of regarding the ranger since the marshes. But the pulling was less frantic, and the muttering had acquired a quality of routine that was different from the desperation of the early days, and occasionally in the mornings when the light was soft and the day's direction had not yet fully imposed itself on his consciousness, there was a brief interval in which he looked at the landscape around him with something that was almost the attention of a creature that has not entirely forgotten how to notice the world it moves through. The forest of Mirkwood announced itself from a distance in the way that large forests announce themselves, not through any dramatic feature, but through the gradual change in the quality of the air and the light, the way the sky above the horizon takes on a different character when there is a great mass of trees ahead of it, a deepening and a softening of the horizon line that tells the experienced traveller that the open country is ending, and something older and more enclosed is beginning. Aragorn had been to Mirkwood before, had dealings with the woodland realm of Thranduil that had given him sufficient familiarity with its borders and its protocols to approach without the uncertainty of a stranger. He had sent word ahead through the channels available to the Dúnedain, and the reception at the forest's edge was formal and not warm but functional. The wood elves received them with the particular quality of elvish courtesy that acknowledges a guest without extending the warmth reserved for those whose presence is genuinely welcome, the courtesy of a people who understand their obligations without necessarily embracing the specific obligations currently before them. Thranduil's realm was the right place for Gollum's keeping because it was, of the available options, the place best suited to the combination of security and minimal additional harm that the situation required. The wood elves were capable of containing him in a way that prevented escape without resorting to the kind of confinement that would have completed the destruction of whatever remained in him worth preserving, and their realm was sufficiently removed from the main currents of the Shadow's attention, or had been, at the time of the arrangement, to offer a reasonable expectation of safe-keeping for the duration that would be needed. Aragorn delivered Gollum to the custody of Thranduil's people with the care of someone transferring a responsibility rather than simply depositing a burden, with the explicit communication of what the prisoner was and what his history contained and why the manner of his keeping mattered. Because Gollum in the hands of those who understood what they held was a different proposition from Gollum in the hands of those who understood him merely as a strange and unpleasant captive. He turned his road westward then, carrying the conclusion of the search and the beginning of the report he needed to make to Gandalf, and the forest closed behind him, with the quietness of old trees absorbing the passage of those who move through them, and the long work of the years settled into the particular stillness of a thing completed, resting now in the hands of what came next. The forest had taken Gollum in, and Aragorn had taken his road westward, and Gandalf had received the report of the capture, with the quiet gravity of someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of news, long enough that its arrival produces not relief exactly, but the particular settling of a long-held tension into the next phase of its resolution, the recognition that one door has closed and another has opened, and that what lies beyond the new door requires a different kind of attention than what the preceding years had required. He came to Mirkwood in the way he came to most places that required his presence, without announcement, without the ceremony that his status might have warranted, with the practical directness of someone whose time is organised entirely around the work rather than around the appearances that surround the work. Thranduil received him with the formal courtesy of a king receiving a wizard of the order, which is to say with respect that contained within it a mild and entirely dignified reluctance, the reluctance of a woodland king who prefers the deep rhythms of his own realm to the complications that tend to arrive in the company of wandering members of the Astari. The prisoner was produced, and Gandalf went to him in the cell that the Wood Elves had constructed with the reasonable security of people who had been told what they held but who had not yet had sufficient time with it to fully credit the telling, and he sat with Gollum in the particular way that Gandalf sat with difficult things, with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is not merely a virtue in such situations, but the primary tool, the instrument without which no other instrument can be properly applied. Gollum did not want to speak. This was not a surprise, and was not, in Gandalf's assessment, an obstacle of the kind that force might address, because force applied to a creature of Gollum's particular psychology produces not disclosure, but deeper concealment, drives the available information further into the defended interior of a mind that has been practicing concealment for centuries, and that is considerably more skilled at it than any interrogator could be at overcoming it. What Gandalf applied instead was time, and the specific quality of attention that time makes possible when it is used well. The attention that does not demand, that does not signal the urgency behind the questions it asks, that presents itself as simply interested in a way that carries no threat and no obvious consequence for the answers it receives. He asked Gollum about the mountains, about the lake and the island and the fish, about the long years before the riddle game, the centuries of the ring's company, the specific texture of what the ring had meant to him in the daily experience of possessing it, rather than in the abstract register of its power and significance. These were not the questions Gandalf most needed answered, but they were the questions that could be asked without triggering the defensive withdrawal that the more important questions would have produced if asked directly, and Gollum, who had not been spoken to with genuine attention in longer than he could have reliably calculated, responded to the attention with the slow, reluctant, suspicious, but ultimately irresistible movement toward disclosure that genuine attention tends to produce even in the most defended of creatures. The name came out across several sessions rather than in a single moment of revelation, which was consistent with how the most important information tends to emerge from sources that understand its value and are not certain they wish to convey it. Gollum did not say Baggins in the way of someone making a deliberate decision to share a piece of intelligence. He said it in the way of someone whose defences have been so gradually and so patiently reduced that the boundary between what is being withheld and what is being disclosed has become, without the speaker quite noticing the process, permeable. He said it in the context of the riddle game, in the recounting of the night in the tunnels that was clearly for him both the central trauma of his post-mountain existence and the narrative he most compulsively returned to, the story of the loss that had organised everything since into a single sustained response. He described the hobbit who had answered his riddles, who had found the ring on the tunnel floor and pocketed it without understanding what he held, who had escaped through the eastern gate and vanished into the world above. He described the name that the hobbit had given, Baggins, said, with the particular quality of someone reciting a piece of evidence so long rehearsed that it has lost the character of memory and acquired the character of fact. And he described the other word, the word that had come to him in the years of searching through whispers gathered in dark places and the overheard conversations of travellers passing through the territories he haunted. The Shire! He had learned it, he said, from the Fat One, and he said it with the hissing satisfaction of someone revealing a secret, and he watched Gandalf's face for the reaction that would tell him whether the secret had value, and Gandalf gave him nothing in the expression to read. Because Gandalf understood that a face that confirms the value of information to the person who has just provided it is a face that teaches that person to negotiate rather than to disclose. What Gandalf had received was confirmation of the worst possibility in its most specific form. Not merely that Gollum knew the ring had gone to a hobbit, which Gandalf had already inferred from the chain of events, but that Gollum knew the name and knew the region, and that this knowledge had not remained entirely within Gollum during the years of his wandering. The Fat One, from whom the word Shire had been obtained, was a reference that Gandalf recognised, with the cold clarity of a mind assembling the implications of new information against the background of what it already holds, as a reference to one of Sauron's servants. one of the creatures that Sauron deployed in the gathering of intelligence from the margins of the world, the network of informants and intermediaries through which the shadow extended its awareness into territories its principal forces had not yet reached. Gollum, in the years of his wandering, had been in proximity to that network, had spoken, or been overheard, or been questioned in ways that his diminished wariness had not recognised as questioning. And what he had known, the name, the region, had passed, or might have passed, into the knowledge of those whose access to Sauron's ear was direct and efficient. This was the dimension of the interrogation's result that Gandalf carried with him out of Mirkwood, with the weight of something that changes the calculation of time available, that compresses the long horizon of the work into something more immediate and more pressured. The ring was in the Shire, in the possession of a hobbit named Baggins, and Sauron either knew this already, or was in possession of the components from which the knowing could be assembled, and the interval between Sauron's possession of those components and Sauron's deployment of the instruments that would act on them was an interval of unknown length, but certainly finite duration. Gandalf left Gollum in the keeping of the Wood Elves with instructions that reflected his revised understanding of the urgency, instructions about the seriousness of the containment required, about the specific dangers of allowing the prisoner any form of outdoor freedom that might facilitate communication with the outside world, about the importance of treating the keeping as a matter of consequence rather than of routine. He rode from Mirkwood westward with the quality of a being moving at the maximum pace, consistent with the other demands on his attention, carrying in one hand the knowledge of what Gollum had revealed, and in the other the knowledge of what that revelation implied about the time remaining before the search for the ring became something other than a search, became instead a race, with the Shire at its centre, and a small hobbit at its heart who did not yet know that the question of his safety had just acquired a new and pressing urgency, and that the old wanderer who visited him occasionally with fireworks and pipe smoke, and the quality of comfortable familiarity was already, in the silence of his own deliberation, calculating the fastest road home. The Nazgul had not always been what they were. This is the fact that the histories tend to pass over in their movement toward the more immediate drama of what the Nine became, and it is worth pausing on, worth allowing to settle into its full weight, before the account of their deployment westward can be understood with the depth it deserves, because the creatures that rode out from Mordor in the direction of the Shire in the years following Gandalf's departure from Mirkwood were not creatures that had always existed in the form they took on that road, were not born to the emptiness and the cold, and the terrible singular purpose that defined them in the age of their most active service to the shadow. They had been men. This is the beginning of their story, and it is also, in a significant sense, the most important fact about them. Not what they had become, which was horrifying enough, but what they had been before the becoming, which was something recognizable, something that had once possessed the full range of human possibility before a specific and deliberate process had reduced that range to a single function, and maintained it there across an expanse of time that no human life was naturally equipped to survive. The 9 rings that Sauron had given to mortal men in the Second Age were given with the full understanding of what they would produce, given as gifts that were investments, given to men of great power and ambition, in the full knowledge that power and ambition are the qualities most susceptible to the specific offer the rings made, the offer of extended life and enhanced capability, of the continuation beyond natural limits of everything that made the recipient feel most fully themselves. The men who accepted the rings were not fools and were not, by the standards of their own time and culture, weak. They were kings and sorcerers and merchant lords, men whose greatness was real and whose desire to preserve and extend that greatness was the most human of impulses taken to the point where the most human of impulses becomes the instrument of its own destruction. They wore the rings, and they felt the power and they felt the life extending beyond its natural term, and then they felt the other things, the gradual fading of the world as it is to the fading eyes of those who are passing slowly and against their will from one mode of existence to a lesser one, the cold that accumulated in them as the warmth of natural life was replaced by the ring-sustained existence that was not life, in any sense that the word was meant to carry, and eventually the complete dissolution of everything that had made them themselves into the single remaining thing that the 9 rings had preserved and the 1 ring directed. They had been 9. In the fullness of their diminishment they were the Nazgul, the ring-wraiths, the Ulairi, servants of the 1 ring whose servitude was not chosen in any moment they could have identified or resisted, but had been arrived at through the long accumulation of choices made before the full consequence of the first choice was visible. The greatest of them was the Witch King of Angmar, who had once been a king of men whose name the records had lost to the erosion of the ages, whose realm had spread across the northern lands in the years of his power, and whose fall, when it came, had come through the specific mechanism that the rings always employed. The extension of life past the point where life is something the liver of it controls, past the point where the person who began the process is still meaningfully present to experience its continuation. He rode at their head now, and had ridden at their head for 3,000 years, and the quality of ancient terrible patience that he carried was the patience of something that has had 3,000 years to reduce itself to a single purpose, and that has, in that reduction, become extraordinarily effective at the single thing remaining to it. Sauron's deployment of the Nine was not a hasty decision. It was the decision of a power that had been reassembling itself across the long centuries of the Third Age with the patience of something that understands the mathematics of its own recovery, that knows the ring must be found before full restoration is possible, that knows the finding must be done correctly rather than quickly, that is capable of waiting for the moment when the deployment of its most powerful servants will be most effective rather than merely most immediate. The intelligence that had been gathered, from Gollum, from other sources, from the long network of watchers and informants that Sauron maintained in the territories between Mordor and the Western Lands, had converged on two words precise enough to act on. Those two words were the same two words that Gandalf had carried westward from Mirkwood with the urgency of someone who understands that the interval between intelligence and action is the critical variable in what is now a race. The Nine were sent westward with those two words as their entire operational brief, and the simplicity of the brief was itself a measure of how completely it had been stripped of everything except the essential. Find the Shire, find the Baggins, find the ring. They rode through the night in the way that the Nazgul rode, not with the visible drama of a military force in movement, not with the banners and the noise and the displacement of air that ordinary cavalry produces, but with the quality of a darkness that moves within the larger darkness. A coldness that is slightly colder than the surrounding cold, a silence that is slightly more silent than the silence it passes through. Those who encountered them on the road, and there were some, travellers and border folk and the occasional ranger moving through the lands east of the Misty Mountains, felt the encounter as a physical experience before they understood it as a perceptual one, felt the temperature drop and the particular quality of fear that is not the ordinary fear of danger, but the deeper fear of something that exists at the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond it, the fear that the presence of the Nazgul produced in living things, not because of what they did, but because of what they were. They passed through communities without stopping, which is to say they passed through communities in the way that a cold front passes through, leaving behind a quality of disturbance in the atmosphere, a residue of unease that the people who felt it could not entirely account for, and that they filed, in the absence of a better explanation, under the general category of a bad night that had passed and was now behind them. The Shire lay ahead of them, westward through the Misty Mountains and through the lands of Eriador, small and green, and entirely unaware in the way that the Shire had always been unaware of the larger currents of the world that moved around it, without disturbing the particular quality of its self-contained peace. And on the roads ahead of them, moving faster than they had moved in many years, with the specific urgency of someone who has understood the shape of what is coming, and who is calculating the time available against the time required, Gandalf was riding toward the same small country, carrying the same urgent knowledge. In the compressed and pressured final hours of the long work of watching and searching that had occupied the better part of 2 decades, and that was now, in the way of long-sustained efforts that reached their decisive moment, contracting from the scale of years to the scale of days, the Nine moved through the darkness of the eastern lands with the terrible patience of things that have been waiting 3,000 years for exactly this errand, and the night received them and carried them westward, and the stars above them burned with the ancient indifference of things that have watched the rise and fall of powers far greater than any currently in motion, and the world turned beneath it all with the slow, unhurried certainty of something that has been turning for a very long time, and that will continue turning long after the current urgency has resolved itself, one way or another, into whatever the next age requires. The road that Gandalf rode westward from Mirkwood was a road he had ridden before in many seasons and many weathers, but he had never ridden it with quite this particular quality of internal pressure. Not the pressure of panic, which was not available to him as a response to difficult circumstances, but the pressure of a mind that has completed its calculation and arrived at a number smaller than it had hoped for, a mind that knows the interval between the current moment and the moment when action becomes necessary is finite and is shrinking, and that is organising itself around that knowledge with the focused efficiency of something that has identified the critical path and is moving along it with everything it has. The calculation was not complicated in its structure, though it was demanding in its implications. Sauron had the components of the answer, the name, the region, and the 9 had been deployed, or would be deployed, with those components as their directive. The ring was in the Shire, in the possession of Frodo Baggins, who did not know what he held in the sense that knowing requires not merely the possession of a fact, but the full understanding of what the fact means and what it demands. Gandalf was the only person positioned to give Frodo that understanding, and Gandalf was currently on the wrong side of the Misty Mountains, with a great deal of difficult country between himself and Bag End, and no certainty about how much time remained before the other forces converging on the same destination arrived there first. He did not ride in a straight line, because the straight line was not available to him, and because the work of the road required more than simple transit, even in circumstances of urgency. There were things to be done along the way, communications to be made, intelligence to be gathered about the movements of the 9 and the current state of the lands through which he was passing. Assessments to be formed about who among his various allies and contacts needed to be informed of what was developing and in what terms. He moved through the lands east of the Misty Mountains with the particular quality of awareness of someone who is simultaneously in transit and in operation, who is covering ground and gathering information, and forming plans and discarding plans and forming new ones, in the continuous internal activity of a mind that has not permitted itself the luxury of a single unoccupied moment since leaving Mirkwood. The passes of the Misty Mountains were difficult in the season he was crossing them, but not impassable, and he came through them into Eriador with the sense of having crossed a threshold that was not merely geographical. The western lands felt different to him now, felt like the territory that would contain the resolution of what had been building across the years of the search, felt like the place where the long-accumulated tension of the work would finally discharge itself into whatever history the current moment was going to produce. Eriador received him with its characteristic quality of sparse, watchful quiet. The wide lands between the Misty Mountains and the Blue, thinly populated in the Third Age compared to the density of settlement they had supported in the days of Arna, carrying in their landscape the residual quality of a place that had once been more fully inhabited and that remembered the inhabitation in the way that landscapes remember things, in the shape of old roads and the foundations of structures that had been absorbed back into the ground across centuries of gradual reclamation by the vegetation that outlasts most things. He passed through Bree, which received him in the way that Bree always received him, with the particular combination of familiarity and wariness that a community develops toward a regular visitor who has never been entirely explicable, whose business in the vicinity is understood to exist without being understood in its specifics, whose presence in the common room of the Prancing Pony produced the mild, collective alertness of people who are not certain whether the thing they are alert to is a threat or simply a strangeness they have not yet found the category for. He gathered what intelligence Bree could offer, which was the intelligence of a crossroads town, the accumulated observations of innkeepers and travellers, and the various people who move through a community that sits at the intersection of roads running in all directions, intelligence that was fragmentary and unverified, but that contained, in the aggregate, useful information about the quality of the roads ahead and the nature of what had been moving on them in recent weeks. What he heard in Bree troubled him in the specific way that information troubles a mind already operating at the edge of its comfortable margin, not because it was conclusive, but because it was consistent with the worst of his calculations rather than with the more generous ones. There were reports of dark riders on the road east of Bree, riders who asked questions in the villages along the way, asked about hobbits specifically, asked in the particular manner of those whose questioning is not conversation but extraction, who want a single piece of information, and who apply to the getting of it a quality of focused intensity that the people being questioned find deeply uncomfortable, without always being able to articulate why. The 9 were moving. They were already in the western lands, already on the roads that led toward the Shire, already asking the questions that would eventually produce the specific directions that the 2 words of their brief had not supplied. The interval that Gandalf had calculated was smaller than he had hoped, and it was getting smaller. He pushed the pace of his riding in the days after Bree with the urgency of the recalculated interval, moving through the green country of Eriador with a speed that was inconsistent with the quality of unhurried wandering that his usual mode of travel presented to the world, the speed of someone who has set aside the performance of casualness, because the circumstances no longer support it. The Shire's borders came into view with the particular quality of the familiar seen in an unfamiliar light. The gentle hills and the hedgerows and the smoke rising from hobbit holes in the late afternoon in the way it had always risen. The absolute undisturbed peace of a place that has not yet understood that the peace is being approached from outside by something that peace alone cannot deflect. He had ridden this road in worry before, had arrived at the Shire with concerns that the Shire's quality of innocent contentment had always seemed to put in gentle proportion, to suggest were perhaps slightly less urgent than they had appeared from a distance. He arrived now with a concern that the Shire's contentment could not proportion, because the concern was not about the general state of the world, but about this specific place at this specific moment, and the specific place was directly in the path of the most dangerous servants of the most dangerous power currently active in Middle-earth. The isolation of his position was something he had been living with for long enough that it had ceased to be a new discomfort, and had become simply a condition of the work, but it registered with particular sharpness in the days of the final approach to the Shire, in the specific form of the recognition that he was carrying information of the most acute urgency, and that the set of people to whom that information could be meaningfully conveyed was very small, and that the most important member of that set was a hobbit in his late 40s, who had spent his entire life in one of the most sheltered and peaceable corners of the world, and who had as yet no framework within which the information could be received and processed in the way it needed to be received and processed. Gandalf had been thinking about the conversation with Frodo across the entire length of the road from Mirkwood, had been composing it and revising it, and composing it again, in the continuous background activity of a mind that understands that the manner of a communication matters as much as its content, that information delivered badly is not merely less effective than information delivered well, but can be actively counterproductive, producing in the recipient a response that serves neither the recipient nor the situation. He wanted to give Frodo the truth in a form that would produce not paralysis but action, not the freezing weight of impossible obligation, but the steady, grounded quality of someone who has been told something difficult and who has found in the telling the resource to meet it. He had known Frodo long enough to believe this was possible. He rode toward Bag End carrying that belief alongside the urgency, and the evening light lay across the Shire in the particular gold of late summer, and the smoke rose from the hobbit holes, and the road was quiet under his horse's feet, and somewhere behind him, on roads converging from the east, the darkness that had been building across the long decades of the search was moving at its own patient, inexorable pace toward the same small country, and the time that remained between the 2 arrivals was, as Gandalf calculated it one final time on the last miles of the road, enough, barely precisely uncomfortably enough, for what needed to be said, and for what needed to begin. The fire in Frodo's hearth was the same fire that had confirmed everything, the fire that had shown Gandalf the letters of flame, and closed the long interval of suspicion into the harder and more demanding country of certainty. And it burned now in the way of fires that have been tended through an evening, lower than it had been, settled into the deep red coherence of coals that have given most of their heat, and are giving the remainder slowly, with the particular quality of warmth that late fires produce, a warmth that is less about temperature than about the quality of light, the way a fire at this stage of its burning fills a room not with brightness, but with a glow that seems to come from inside the objects it touches rather than from outside them, that makes familiar rooms into places of more concentrated and more restful familiarity. Gandalf sat beside it and looked at Frodo across the low table between them, and understood, with the full weight of everything the road from Mirkwood had carried, that the conversation now before him was the conversation that all the preceding decades of work had been in service of, that the confirmation in the archive and the testimony of Gollum and the 17 years of Aragorn's ranging and the long, slow accumulation of evidence and inference that had begun as a small wrongness in the texture of a familiar thing had all been oriented, without his having fully articulated this to himself until this moment, toward this room and this fire and this hobbit and this conversation. He had thought carefully about where to begin, and he began where he had decided to begin. Not with the urgency, not with the 9 on the road, not with the specific and pressured timeline that had driven the pace of his riding through Eriador. Because urgency received before understanding produces not clarity but panic, and panic in a hobbit who had never had reason to develop the specific resources that panic management requires would not serve the situation. He began instead with Bilbo. With the birthday party, which Frodo remembered with the fullness of someone for whom it had been the most extraordinary event of his life to that point. The fireworks and the food and the speech and the moment of Bilbo's disappearance that had seemed, in the general festivity of the evening, almost like a final trick before the old hobbit's retirement, rather than the thing it actually was. He walked Frodo back through the history of the ring that Bilbo had left him, back through the 60 years of Bilbo's possession of it, and the qualities it had displayed in that possession, the invisibility, the extended life, the quality of attachment that had made Bilbo's relinquishment of it in the study, on the evening of the party, one of the most difficult things Gandalf had ever watched a person do, and one of the most important. Frodo listened with the quality of attention that Gandalf had been counting on, and that did not disappoint him. The steady, grounded attentiveness of a hobbit who had inherited from Bilbo not merely the ring and the hole and the maps on the study wall, but something of Bilbo's particular intellectual seriousness, the capacity to receive complicated information without the defensive reflexes that complicated information tends to produce in those who have organised their sense of safety around the assumption of a comprehensible world. He asked questions at the right moments, not the questions of someone seeking reassurance, which would have been the questions of a mind already contracting around its fear, but the questions of someone building understanding, filling in the gaps in the account with the specific pieces of information that the account required, in order to cohere into something that could be acted upon. When Gandalf reached the test in the fire, the letters appearing in the heat, the confirmation of the worst possibility, Frodo's response was silence, and the silence was not the silence of incomprehension, but the silence of someone allowing a very large piece of information to complete its arrival, to settle into the space it was going to occupy, and find its relationship to everything already present there. The weight of what Gandalf was laying on the table between them was not a weight that could be made lighter by the manner of its laying. He had thought about this on the road, and had arrived at the conclusion that the attempt to soften the weight, to present it in terms that reduced its immediate impact at the cost of its accuracy, would be a form of disrespect to Frodo that the situation did not permit, that Frodo deserved the truth in the form the truth had taken rather than in a more comfortable form that was not quite the truth, and so he gave it fully, the One Ring. Sauron's creation, the instrument of his power and the vessel of a significant portion of his will, the thing that Frodo had been carrying in his pocket through the ordinary days of his life in the Shire, with no more ceremony than a set of keys or a folding knife. He gave it with the steadiness of someone who has accepted the difficulty of the communication and who trusts the recipient to receive it, and Frodo received it with exactly the quality of steadiness that trust of this kind requires and deserves, the steadiness not of someone who does not feel the weight, but of someone who feels it fully, and who does not permit the feeling to become the end of the conversation. There was a moment, Gandalf noted it with the peripheral attention he was giving to Frodo's responses, while the larger part of his attention remained on the structure of the account, when the full personal implication of what he was being told arrived in Frodo's understanding, the moment when the history of the ring stopped being a history of large events involving distant powers and became, instead, the specific story of the thing in his own possession, and what that thing's presence in his possession meant for the specific safety of the specific life he had been living in this specific hole in the hill. The moment was visible in the quality of Frodo's stillness, a slight deepening of it, a slight change in the quality of his attention, the internal adjustment of someone recalibrating their sense of their own situation. It passed quickly, resolved not into fear but into the next question, which was the question of what was to be done, and the quickness of that resolution told Gandalf something about Frodo's character that confirmed what he had suspected and that he would find himself returning to Akros everything that followed. What was to be done was the part of the conversation that carried the urgency, and Gandalf gave it plainly. The 9 were on the roads, asking questions in the villages east of the Shire, moving with the directional certainty of things that have been given enough of the answer to find the rest of it, through the systematic application of force to the available witnesses along the way. The Shire was not safe, and the ring was not safe in the Shire, and Frodo was not safe as the ring's carrier in the Shire, and the place that was safe, or rather the place that was less unsafe, the place where the knowledge and the counsel existed that the situation required, was Rivendell. The House of Elrond, which was many days of travel to the east through country that was currently occupied in part by the very riders whose approach had driven the urgency of this conversation. The path there would not be without danger. The path there would require of Frodo things that the Shire had not prepared him for, and that could not be fully prepared for in the time available, and yet the path was the path. And Frodo, when Gandalf laid it before him, with the full clarity of what it contained and what it cost, did not flinch from it in the way of someone who has been given permission to refuse, but received it in the way of someone who has understood that the decision was already made in the moment the full truth arrived. That understanding and acceptance had come together in the same movement of a nature that had been more prepared for this than either of them had known. The ethical weight that Gandalf carried out of that conversation, and would carry for the full length of everything that followed, was the weight that belongs specifically to the person who lays a great burden on someone they love, who understands with full clarity both the necessity of the laying and the cost to the person who will bear it, and who cannot resolve the tension between those two understandings into anything more comfortable than the knowledge that the necessity was real and that the person chosen was equal to it. He had loved Frodo in the way that Gandalf loved the particular kinds of goodness he encountered in the world, with a deep, uncomplicated admiration of someone who recognizes a quality of character that the world needs, and that is rarer than the world generally knows. Laying the ring's history and the ring's demand on that goodness was not a thing he did lightly, even in circumstances that left no lighter option. The fire burned low between them as the conversation completed itself, and outside the windows of Bag End the Shire lay in the last of the evening's quiet, and Gandalf sat for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has done the thing that needed doing, and who is allowing the doing of it to settle before the next necessary movement begins, and the night held them both in its darkness, and the road that Frodo would take in the morning was already the road it had always been going to be, patient and waiting, lit by the same stars that had burned above every road in every age, indifferent to the weight of what travelled beneath them, and entirely sufficient in their ancient and unhurried light to show the way. The cage in Mirkwood was empty before anyone who needed to know of its emptiness had been told, and this was the particular quality of the disaster. Not that it was dramatic. Not that it announced itself with the clarity of a thing that knows it is a catastrophe and presents itself accordingly, but that it was quiet, that it had the character of an absence rather than an event, the character of something that was not there rather than something that had happened, which is the most difficult kind of problem for any system of vigilance to detect, because vigilance is organised around the detection of presences and movements, and the thing it is least equipped to notice is the thing that is simply no longer where it was placed. The Wood Elves had been keeping Gollum with the reasonable security of people who had been told the prisoner was important, and who had constructed around that telling the kind of containment appropriate to an important prisoner. Secure but not punitive, firm but not cruel, the containment of a realm that understood itself as a keeper of difficult things rather than as a place of punishment. And that had organised the keeping accordingly. What they had not fully credited in the construction of that containment was the specific quality of Gollum's relationship to confinement, not his physical capacity for escape, which was considerable but not extraordinary, but his psychological relationship to the particular problem of a barrier, the 5 centuries of practice at finding the gaps in any structure that had been arranged to keep something of his size and his particular adaptations contained. He had been given, at some point in the period of his keeping, a degree of outdoor access, permitted to move within a defined exterior area under supervision in the way that the Wood Elves managed the exercise requirements of those in their custody, who were not confined entirely to interior spaces. This was not a failure of intelligence on the part of his keepers. It was a reasonable accommodation to the evident suffering that total interior confinement produced in a creature that had, despite the centuries underground, retained enough of the hobbit nature to find complete enclosure without any access to open air, a form of distress that interfered with the basic functioning that even a prisoner requires in order to remain a viable source of the information its captors need. The Wood Elves had observed the distress, had made the accommodation, and had supervised the outdoor periods with the attentiveness of guards who understood the prisoner was not to be permitted to use the access as a vector for escape. They had been attentive in the ways they knew to be attentive. What they had not been attentive to, what they could not have been attentive to without a knowledge of Gollum's specific capabilities that Aragorn's instructions had conveyed in general terms, but that the specific application required in specific circumstances had not fully transmitted, was the particular combination of patience and physical agility that Gollum brought to the problem of a tree. He had gone up into a tree during one of the outdoor periods. This was not in itself alarming. The guards had observed him climbing before, had observed it as the behaviour of a creature that finds elevated positions instinctively preferable to ground-level ones, and had registered it as a known behaviour rather than as the initiation of an escape. What they had not registered, because it had not yet been demonstrated, was the speed at which the behaviour could transition from the known pattern of climbing as comfort to the different and more purposeful pattern of climbing as transit. The way a creature with 5 centuries of practice at moving through narrow and difficult spaces in darkness could, given sufficient height above the ground and sufficient canopy density, cease to be a prisoner and become simply something moving through a forest, which is what forests are full of and which forests are entirely indifferent to containing. By the time the transition was registered, the transition was complete, and the outdoor period that had begun as an accommodation to a prisoner's distress had ended as the mechanism of an escape that would have consequences extending far beyond the borders of Thranduil's realm. The news reached Gandalf in the way that bad news reaches a person already operating at the limit of manageable difficulty, as an addition to a weight already close to the maximum the current structure could bear, as a development that did not change the fundamental nature of the situation, but that removed from it one of the assumptions on which the current plan had been resting. He had left Gollum in Mirkwood with the confidence, not of certainty, but of reasonable assurance, the assurance of someone who has delivered a responsibility to capable hands, and who has allowed himself to direct his attention to the next problem in the sequence on the basis of that assurance. The empty cage dissolved that assurance retroactively, produced in its place the specific discomfort of understanding that a piece of the situation had been less secure than the overall plan had assumed, and that the piece in question was not a minor one. Gollum Free was a different variable than Gollum contained. Gollum Free was a creature with specific knowledge, the name, the region, moving through the world without the constraint that custody had placed on the use of that knowledge, moving with the directional sensitivity of something that could feel the ring's location, and that would orient itself toward that location with the unerring persistence of an obsession that had survived 5 centuries of underground solitude and 17 years of continuous ranging pursuit and months of captivity without diminishing in the slightest its fundamental intensity. The direction Gollum would move was not uncertain. The same sensitivity that had guided him toward the Dead Marshes, that had accumulated through the years of wandering the specific intelligence about the Shire and the Baggins that had eventually found its way into Sauron's network, would now guide him westward with a precision that his time in Mirkwood had, if anything, refined rather than disrupted. The ring was closer than it had been when he was in the eastern wilderness, and the closeness would register in him as a pull of corresponding intensity, drawing him along the most direct available route through the lands between Mirkwood and the Shire with the focused purposefulness of a creature that has been given, by the accident of its captivity and release, a more specific orientation than it had possessed before. He would not arrive quickly. The distance was considerable, and Gollum's mode of travel was the mode of something that moves at night and hides by day, that prioritizes concealment over speed, and that navigates around obstacles rather than through them. But he would arrive. The question of when was a question of weeks and months rather than years, and the weeks and months available for the situation in the Shire to resolve itself, before Gollum's arrival added its own complication to the existing complications were the same weeks and months that the 9 were already consuming on their own approach from the east. What the escape meant in the larger accounting of the situation was a closing of the window that the containment had held open, the window in which Gollum's knowledge was sequestered from active use, in which the specific intelligence he carried about the ring's location was held in a place where it could not be communicated to those who would act on it most dangerously. That window had never been permanently secure. Gandalf had understood this, had known that Mirkwood was a holding position rather than a permanent solution, but its closing earlier than anticipated compressed the timeline in a way that the situation, already operating on margins thinner than Gandalf would have chosen if choosing had been available to him, could not easily absorb. He turned the development over in the quiet of his own deliberation, and found in the turning not despair. Despair was not among the responses his nature made available to him in circumstances that still contained the possibility of right action, but the particular quality of clarified urgency that comes from understanding that the time available for the work is less than one had hoped, and that the work therefore requires a concentration and a commitment even greater than what has already been given. The forest of Mirkwood stood in its ancient quiet behind the fact of the empty cage, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere within it or beyond its eastern edges, Gollum was already moving, small and purposeful and terrible, in the specific way of things driven by a need that nothing in the world has yet proved sufficient to extinguish, westward through the darkness, toward the ring, toward the Shire, toward the convergence that the age had been building toward across all the long years of the search, patient as water finding the low ground, as inevitable as the turning of the age itself. The hall in which the Council of Elrond assembled was open to the sky in the manner of Rivendell's most important spaces, not the enclosed, roof-heavy architecture of places built against the weather and the dark, but the open, light-receiving architecture of a dwelling that understands itself as continuous with the natural world rather than defended against it, that places its most significant gatherings in the position of being witnessed by the sky and the mountains and the particular quality of Rivendell's light, which was different from the light of anywhere else in Middle-earth, in a way that was difficult to describe precisely, but that everyone who had been to Rivendell recognised immediately upon returning to it, a quality of clarity and rest that the valley's specific geography produced, and that the long habitation of elves within it had, across the centuries, deepened rather than diminished. The trees around the court held the last of the autumn colour, and the river could be heard in its perpetual articulate movement through the valley below, and the mountains stood above everything in their permanent indifference to the affairs of the small and consequential beings assembling in the courtyard beneath them. It was a place designed, whether consciously or through the long accumulation of rightness that good dwelling places acquire, for the speaking of important truths, for the kind of counsel that requires its participants to understand themselves as small against the background of what they are deciding, and the beings assembling in it on that autumn morning had, collectively, sufficient wisdom to understand what the setting was offering them, and sufficient gravity to accept the offering. They came from everywhere that mattered in the current state of the world, from Rivendell itself, where Elrond presided with the particular quality of authority that belongs to someone who has been present at most of the significant decisions of the past 3 ages, and who carries that presence not as a burden of accumulated tragedy, but as the deep, settled knowledge of someone who has seen enough of history to understand its patterns without losing the capacity to be moved by its specific instances. From Lothlorien, in the person of Legolas, whose presence at the council was overdetermined by the specific piece of news he had been sent to deliver, the news that Gandalf had already absorbed in the private reckoning of his own deliberation, but that the council required to hear stated plainly in the formal context of the assembled representatives, so that its implications could be understood collectively rather than individually. From the remnant of the dwarven kingdoms, from the world of men in its various surviving configurations, from the company of hobbits in the unprecedented form of 4 members of the most peaceable people in Middle-earth sitting in the most consequential council of the age, and from the rangers of the north in the person of Aragorn, who arrived at Rivendell carrying everything the years of the search had built into him, and who sat in the council with the particular quality of someone whose contribution to the proceedings was not primarily verbal but experiential, the quality of someone who has spent 17 years in the direct service of the question now before the assembly, and whose presence is itself a form of testimony. Gandalf spoke at length, because the account required length, required the full context of the decades of suspicion and research and confirmation and search, the account of the archive in Minas Tirith, and what Isildur's scroll had contained, the account of Gollum's capture, and the interrogation in Mirkwood and what the interrogation had yielded, the account of the Nine and their deployment and the urgency that had driven the final approach to the Shire, and the conversation at Bag End that had set Frodo on the road to Rivendell. He spoke with the clarity of someone who has been organising this account in his mind for a long time, who has had the full length of the road from Mirkwood and through Eriador and through everything that had followed to arrange the material into the shape that would be most useful to the people who needed to receive it. And the council listened with the quality of attention that the assembled wisdom of that gathering was capable of producing. The deep, active, evaluative attention of beings who understood that what they were hearing was not a recitation of past events, but the operational context for a decision of the highest possible consequence. Then Legolas spoke, and the specific weight his words carried into the council was the weight of a failure honestly reported. The weight of a piece of news that had the particular quality of adding a new difficulty to a situation already at the limit of its comfortable management. He reported the escape from Mirkwood in the direct manner of an elf prince, who understands that the honour of honest acknowledgment is worth more than the comfort of a softened account, who brings to the council the full truth of what has occurred in his father's realm without the mitigation that would have made the telling easier on both the teller and the audience. The escape had happened. Gollum was free. The knowledge Gollum carried, the name, the region, the specific intelligence that had already found its way, through channels whose full extent remained uncertain, toward the shadow in the east, was no longer contained in any sense that the word contained could be applied to it with confidence. The council received this with the silence that significant bad news receives from assemblies of people wise enough to understand that the first response to bad news should be understanding rather than reaction, that the space between hearing and responding is not a silence of shock but a silence of integration, of allowing the new information to find its proper relationship to everything already known. What followed was the reckoning, the accounting that the assembled wisdom of the council performed, collectively and in sequence, of the full state of what was now before them. The ring had been found. Its location was known to Sauron, or would be known to him through the multiple vectors of intelligence that the preceding years had opened. Through Gollum, through the Nine's approaching identification of the Shire, through the general convergence of attention that had been building around the question of the ring's location since Gandalf's confirmation in the archive. The ring could not remain in the Shire, which was established. The ring could not remain in Rivendell, which Elrond understood with the clarity of someone who knows the limits of his own realm's capacity to resist the specific force that possession of the ring would bring against it. The ring could not be wielded by any of the beings present, because the ring's nature was to corrupt the will toward the domination that its maker had encoded in it, and the beings with sufficient power to consider wielding it were precisely the beings whose power would make their corruption by it most catastrophic. The ring had to be destroyed, and the only place it could be destroyed was Orodruin, the mountain in the heart of Mordor where it had been made, and the being who would carry it there would need to be someone in whom the ring's specific corruptions found the least available purchase. Someone small enough in the reckoning of power that the ring's offer of power had less to work with, someone whose nature was most fully oriented toward the ordinary rather than the extraordinary. Someone who had already demonstrated in the months of carrying it from the Shire to Rivendell the specific quality of resistance that the ring's proximity could not, even across that length of time. As entirely overcome, Frodo stood and offered to take the ring to Mordor in the particular manner of someone who does not experience the offer as heroism, who does not feel themselves rising to a great occasion, but simply identifying the thing that needs to be done and acknowledging, without drama, that they appear to be the person positioned to do it. The council received the offer with the silence that follows the arrival of something that has resolved a question everyone present understood to be unresolvable by any of the other means available to them, the silence of beings wise enough to recognize the specific quality of the moment they were in, and humble enough not to fill it immediately with words. Gandalf looked at Frodo across the assembled council, with the full weight of everything he knew about the road ahead, and everything he had come to understand about the nature of the person now committed to walking it. And what he felt was not the uncomplicated pride of someone watching a protégé rise to their moment, but the more complex and more honest feeling of someone who loves a person deeply, and who has just watched that person volunteer for the most dangerous errand of the age, and who cannot protect them from it, And who will walk beside them as far as walking beside them remains possible? And who understands, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a very long time looking clearly at difficult things, that this is both the worst and the best that the situation makes available, and that the best in circumstances like these is something to be held onto with both hands? There is a question that runs beneath the entire history of the hunt for Gollum, like a current beneath the surface of a river, present in everything, rarely visible, shaping the movement of everything above it without announcing its own presence or its own nature. And the question is this: what does it mean that the creature who could not be saved became the instrument by which everything was? It is not a comfortable question, in the sense of a question whose answer resolves cleanly into a satisfying conclusion. Because the answer does not resolve cleanly, because the story of Gollum is not a story with clean resolutions, but a story with the specific kind of meaning that resists reduction into the simpler forms that meaning sometimes takes when the events that generate it are less morally complex than these events were. But it is a question worth sitting with, worth allowing to breathe in the space of this telling before the account moves toward its final resting place, because the meaning that lives in it is the kind of meaning that illuminates not merely the specific history it emerges from, but something more general about the nature of the world and the particular way that the world's deepest workings tend to operate, not through the direct application of power toward intended outcomes, but through the long, patient, indirect movement of things that look, from close proximity, like failure and loss, and the irreversible ruin of what might have been, and that reveal themselves, from the longer view that only retrospect makes available, as something else entirely. Tolkien understood Gollum as a figure of theological significance, and the significance was not the significance of the villain or the monster or the obstacle to be overcome, categories that the simpler versions of the story's moral architecture might have assigned him, but the significance of the figure whose presence in the narrative is the hinge on which the narrative's deepest meaning turns. He had written, in the private correspondence that his son Christopher would eventually make available to the world, about the specific role that mercy plays in the structure of what happens at the crack of doom, about the fact that Frodo's failure at the mountain's edge, the moment when Frodo stood at the lip of the fire and claimed the ring rather than destroying it, was not the end of the story but the place where a different and older mercy became operative, the mercy that Bilbo had extended in the dark beneath the mountains 60 years before, and that Frodo had extended forward across all the years of the journey. The mercy that had kept Gollum alive when the logic of pure self-interest and strategic calculation would have argued for a different outcome. The mercy had seemed, in most of the moments when it was being extended, like a risk, like the indulgence of a sentiment in circumstances that called for pragmatism, like the kind of choice that costs more than it returns. And then, at the one moment when everything depended on what happened at the fire's edge, the mercy that had been extended to an apparently ruined and unredeemable creature became the mechanism through which the unreachable became reachable, through which the thing that could not be done by any act of will was accomplished by an act of loss. Gollum bit the ring from Frodo's finger at the crack of doom. This is one of the most precisely constructed moments in the entire edifice of Tolkien's mythology, constructed with the care of someone who understands that the meaning of a narrative is most fully expressed not in its grandest gestures, but in its most specific and most carefully weighted particular events, and this event carries more weight per word than almost any other event in the legendarium. Gollum had been following them, had followed Frodo and Sam through Mordor with the obsessive persistence of something that cannot conceive of a world in which it has abandoned the pursuit of its precious, that will follow the ring into the heart of the enemy's own realm, because the alternative to following is not a life lived without the ring, but simply the absence of a life organised around anything at all. He had bitten the ring free and had danced at the edge of the fire with it, and had fallen with the ring into the fire that was the only place in Middle-earth where the ring could be unmade, had accomplished through the uncontrolled excess of his own joy and grief and obsession the thing that Frodo's will had been insufficient to accomplish at the moment it was most required. The mercy that made this possible was not Frodo's mercy alone, though Frodo's mercy was essential to it. It was a longer mercy, the mercy that Gandalf had counselled in the Shire when he had told Frodo that even the very wise cannot see all ends, the mercy that Bilbo had extended in the dark when he had stood over Gollum with a sword and had chosen not to use it, the mercy that runs through the structure of the legendarium as one of its organising principles, not because Tolkien was naive about the cost of mercy, or the genuine danger that unmerciful calculation would have been right to identify in the decision to let Gollum live, but because Tolkien understood something about the way that the world's deepest workings operate that the purely strategic view cannot accommodate. He understood that the good that mercy does is often not the good that the merciful person intends or can foresee, that mercy extended to a ruined creature in the full knowledge that the creature is ruined and dangerous and unlikely to change is not the same thing as the sentimental refusal to acknowledge the danger, but is rather the specific recognition that the creature's life is not the property of the person with the power to end it, that something larger than the immediate strategic calculation is at stake in the decision, and that the larger thing has a way of working through the small decisions of individual lives toward outcomes that the individuals making those decisions could not have predicted or planned. The paradox of Gollum is the paradox of the instrument that does not know it is an instrument, that is acting entirely from its own need and its own obsession and its own 5 centuries deep attachment to the thing it cannot release, and that in acting from those entirely personal and entirely self-directed motivations accomplishes something that the most powerful and most purposeful beings in Middle-earth had been unable to accomplish through any combination of their power and their purpose. This is not a paradox that resolves into a simple lesson about the value of unlikely allies or the importance of keeping even dangerous creatures alive on the chance that they might prove useful. It is a more demanding paradox than that, one that requires of its interpreter a willingness to sit with the full complexity of what it contains. The genuine tragedy of Gollum's history, the genuine danger he represented, the genuine cost of the mercy extended to him, and the genuine fact that without that mercy, and without the creature that mercy preserved, the ring would not have gone into the fire, and Sauron would not have been defeated, and the age would have ended differently. Aragorn understood this, in the way that someone who has spent 17 years tracking a creature through the wilderness, and has looked into its eyes in the moment of its capture, understands the things that cannot be learned from books or from second-hand accounts. He had seen Gollum in the marsh darkness, and had recognized in him both the danger and the remnant, both the ruin and the faint buried trace of what the ruin had been made from. And he had carried that recognition forward through the journey to Mirkwood, and through everything that followed with the care of someone who understands that the recognition matters even when, especially when, it cannot be acted on in any way that changes the immediate practical outcome. The recognition was not sentiment. It was the specific quality of sight that Aragorn's character and his training, and the particular quality of his lineage had made possible in him. The quality that sees a person where the easier view sees only a creature, that holds open the category of personhood, even for those in whom personhood has been most thoroughly obscured. It was in its way the same quality that Bilbo had expressed in the dark beneath the mountains, and that Frodo had carried forward from Bilbo, and that had eventually, at the crack of doom, made the difference between one ending and another. The mercy had moved through the lineage of those who chose it, from Bilbo to Frodo to the quiet, steady recognition in Aragorn's eyes on the night in the marsh, and the world had been changed by it, and the change had looked, at every step of its making, like something other than the salvation it turned out to be. The king who sat upon the throne of Gondor in the years of the Fourth Age was not the ranger who had moved through the eastern wilderness for 17 years, with a cord and a name and a direction and very little else, and yet he was entirely that ranger. Was the ranger completed rather than replaced? Was the sum of every year of the search, and every cold trail and every uneventful territory, covered with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the important work does not announce its importance in the moments of its doing, but only in the long retrospect of what the doing made possible? Aragorn had been crowned in the ruins of a city that was already being rebuilt, on a day in early summer when the air above Minas Tirith smelled of stone dust and new growth simultaneously, the smell of a place in the specific process of becoming what it would be rather than what it had been, and he had received the crown with the quality of a person receiving something that had been prepared for him across the entire length of his life, not with surprise, which would have been dishonest, and not with the performance of reluctance, which would have been a different kind of dishonesty, but with the gravity of someone who has spent so long in the full understanding of what the moment would require, that the moment's arrival is less a revelation than a completion, the closing of a shape that had been open for a very long time. But the crown was the visible thing, the thing that the histories would record and that the people who witnessed it would carry in their memories as the image of the day. What the histories would not record, because histories are organised around the visible and the ceremonial and the datable, was the invisible foundation beneath the crown, the 17 years of ranging through the eastern wilderness, the cold trails and the warming trails, the fish bones in the shelter of riverbanks, the long months of covering territory that yielded nothing, and the discipline required to continue covering it anyway. The night in the Dead Marshes and the small, terrible creature in the shelter of the marsh grass, and the quality of recognition that had passed between the captor and the captured on that dark and consequential evening. These things were not recorded because they did not have the shape that historical record recognizes. They were not battles or treaties or the kind of events that changed the visible surface of the world in ways that subsequent observers can identify and describe. They were the interior work, the preparation, the long, unglamorous service to a necessity that had not yet revealed its full shape. And they were, in the accounting that mattered most, the substance of what the crown rested on. There is a specific kind of cost that this kind of work extracts, and it is a cost that is not fully visible even to those who pay it, not because they are unaware of it, but because the nature of the work is such that the paying of it and the doing of the work are the same activity, that there is no separation between the cost and the thing the cost purchases, no moment in which the expenditure is made and the return received and the transaction completed. Aragorn had spent the years of his prime, the years between his early 20s and his late 50s, the decades in which a person of his gifts and his lineage might have been building the visible structures of a life, accumulating the kind of presence in the world that presence in the world usually accumulates, in the wilderness, in the cold, in the sustained invisibility of someone doing work that could not be acknowledged or celebrated, because acknowledging it would have endangered it. He had forgone the ordinary expressions of the life that was available to him in favour of the extraordinary demands of the life that was necessary, and he had done this not through the suppression of the desire for the ordinary life, but through the specific discipline of someone who understands that the desire and the necessity are both real, and that the necessity, in the circumstances of his age and his lineage and his particular position in the unfolding of events, takes precedence without cancelling the reality of what it displaces. The love that had sustained him through the years of the search was the love of Arwen and Domiel, Elrond's daughter, who had told him on the hill of Cerin Amroth in Lothlorien, during one of the rare intervals of the ranging years when his road had taken him through that country, that she would wait for him and that she would bind her fate to his, and who had been waiting across the full length of the years that followed, with the patience of someone for whom patience is not a strain but a form of faithfulness, the expression in time of a commitment made outside of time. Aragorn had carried that commitment through the wilderness the way he had carried everything else essential to the work, not as a weight, but as a sustaining presence, the knowledge of something permanent held against the impermanence of the daily difficulty. The knowledge that the life he was working toward was real, and was waiting rather than theoretical and conditional. It had not made the years easier in any practical sense, but it had made them possible in the sense that the possible and the endurable are sometimes the same thing, and that the difference between a burden that is carried to its destination and a burden that is set down before the destination is reached is often simply the presence or absence of the knowledge that the destination exists and that someone is there. What the years of the search had built in him, beyond the wilderness skills and the knowledge of the eastern lands and the specific intelligence about Gollum that had eventually become the foundation of the Council of Elrond's understanding, was a quality of character that the kingship would require and that no shorter or easier preparation could have produced. He had learned, in the years of ranging, the specific form of authority that does not depend on the recognition of those over whom it is exercised, had learned to be the thing that was needed in circumstances where no one knew that what was needed was being provided, had learned the discipline of caring about an outcome that he would not be present to celebrate, had learned the patience of someone whose work is organised around a timeline that extends far beyond the boundaries of any individual life or individual effort. These are the qualities that the histories call wisdom when they see them in a king, and they are right to call them that. But what the histories tend to omit is the specific curriculum through which wisdom of this kind is acquired. The cold trails and the uneventful territories and the years of systematic negative evidence, and the night in the Dead Marshes and the long road north through the brown lands, with a prisoner who hated him, all of it, every unglamorous and unrecorded hour of it, contributing its specific increment to the formation of the person who would eventually be equal to what the age required of him. Gondor flourished under him in the way that kingdoms flourish under rulers who have understood before their rule begins what ruling costs and what it requires and what it is for. Not for the glory of the ruler, not for the demonstration of the lineage, not for the satisfaction of the ambition that the long wait of the Dunedain succession might have been expected to produce in anyone who had spent decades as the uncrowned heir to a kingdom that did not yet know it needed a king, but for the people of it, for the slow and patient work of building the conditions in which ordinary lives can be lived with the ordinary dignity that ordinary lives deserve. He ruled as he had ranged, with the full application of everything he had, with the willingness to do the necessary thing in the necessary way, without requiring that the doing of it be visible or celebrated, with the specific quality of care for the individual that comes from having spent years attending to the specific traces of a single individual moving through a landscape too wide for that individual to be anything other than invisible to every observer, except the one who had committed to finding him. He had learned to look carefully at small things in the eastern wilderness, and he carried that learning into the governance of a kingdom, and the kingdom was the better for it in ways that its people felt without always being able to name the source of the feeling, the way people feel the quality of a good foundation in the steadiness of the structure it supports without needing to see the foundation itself to know that it is there. The Misty Mountains stood to the north and east of Minas Tirith in their permanent and indifferent grandeur, the same mountains they had always been, carrying in their stone the compressed record of ages that had preceded the current one by intervals so vast that the current age and all its urgencies were simply the most recent of a long series of urgencies that the stone had outlasted and would continue to outlast. Somewhere in those mountains, in the system of tunnels and caves that ran beneath the high passes, the lake and the island that had been Gollum's world for 5 centuries still existed in the cold dark, empty now, the water moving over its stones in the way that water moves over stones without any reference to the events that have occurred in its vicinity, without memory and without anticipation, simply and continuously itself. The fish were still in the water, the darkness was still the darkness. And the king who sat in Minas Tirith had stood in that darkness once, at the end of 17 years of searching, and had looked into the pale eyes of the creature that had made its home there, and had seen in those eyes the thing that seeing clearly requires the willingness to see, the ruin and the remnant together, the damage and the irreducible something that the damage had not entirely consumed, and had treated what he saw with the seriousness it deserved, and had carried it forward into everything that followed, and the world that followed had been shaped, in ways both visible and invisible, by the quality of that seeing. The chronicle has brought you here, to this quiet place at the end of a long and patient telling, and the telling itself has been a kind of journey, not the journey of urgency and pursuit and the convergence of forces in the dark, but the gentler journey of understanding, of following the long threads of a story backward and forward through the years until the full shape of it becomes visible, until what seemed from the outside like a simple tale of a ring found and a ring destroyed reveals itself as something woven from many lives and many choices and many long, unglamorous years of work conducted in the shadows of the world by people who understood what was at stake before anyone else did, and who carried that understanding through all the cold and uneventful intervals that precede the moments that histories remember. You have travelled far tonight, through the archives of Minas Tirith and the darkness of the Dead Marshes and the forests of Mirkwood and the quiet hearth of Bag End and the open sky above the court of Rivendell, and the travelling is done now, and what remains is simply the resting. The Shire is peaceful tonight in the way it has always been peaceful. The smoke rising from the hobbit holes in the early dark, the gardens settled into their autumn quiet, the roads empty and soft with the particular softness of roads in small countries where nothing urgent has passed along them for a long time. The Misty Mountains stand at the edge of the world to the east, patient and enormous, holding in their stone the memory of everything that has occurred in their shadow across the uncountable ages, holding it without weight, the way old things hold the memory of what has passed through them, not as burden, but as depth, the depth that makes them what they are, and that you can feel when you stand in their presence, if you are quiet enough to feel it. The stars are out above the hill, the same stars that burned above every road and every decision and every long, cold night of ranging through the eastern wilderness, the same stars that have always burned, patient and sufficient and entirely indifferent to the urgency of the affairs they illuminate, shining because that is what they do, because that is what they have always done, because the shining requires nothing of them and nothing of you. Somewhere in the deep quiet of this telling, the watch that was kept across 17 years of dark and difficult country has completed itself, has resolved into the peace that the keeping of it made possible, and you are held in that peace now the way the Shire is held in it, gently, completely, without condition. The search is over. The ring has gone into the fire. The age has turned. Let the mountains keep their ancient quiet. Let the roads rest in their evening stillness. Let the stars continue their long and patient shining above a world that is tonight at peace. You are warm, and the dark is soft, and the story has carried you as far as it needed to carry you, and now it sets you down carefully in the gentlest available place. The watch is not yours tonight. Rest now and be at peace.